Chapter 661. This pause was so minuscule to a cultivator like her, just a fraction of a second for a normal person. In the next moment, this old monster from Jiaodong Commandery did not hesitate to send a thread of vital energy into the bone whistle in front of her chest. The serpents in the sea lived in groups. While they were not as strong as the dragons on land, the serpents were more difficult to deal with than the dragons on land due to their large numbers. This bone whistle was made from the spine of the strongest serpent in the group. Back then, to kill the leading serpent, one needed to have the power to deal with the entire group. After the death of the strongest soaring serpent, it was impossible for a leader like that to appear in the group of soaring serpents. Therefore, this bone whistle was what the soaring serpents feared the most. When she sent a thread of vital energy into the bone whistle, what activated was not just the sound that Jiaodong Commandery had made these serpents follow orders when they were taming them, but also the presence of their king. In a group where the strong ate the weak, this kind of natural fear was more terrifying than any medicine. So Zheng En, this old monster from Jiaodong Commandery, believed that even if Qin Yaoyin used some kind of medicine to control these serpents would turn on Qin Yaoyin. Other than a moment of surprise, she didn't feel any disappointment or fear. But nothing went as she had expected. When the bone whistle in front of her chest started to give off shrill cries, and the presence of the leader of the serpents exploded, the dozen serpents that came out of the dust mountains did not hesitate at all. The energy stored in their bodies surged out without restraint, summoning the clouds and rain from all directions and smashing into the sky. Countless loud collisions erupted in the air, as if several hundred God King ships were colliding in the sea. Raindrops that were larger than fists almost filled the area covered by thousands of dust mountains with the explosion. In the next moment, they were shattered by an incomparably violent force and turned into fine powder. Water quickly gathered on the ground. The amount of rain in this moment was likely more than what this area had accumulated in decades. Strangely, the water reached everyone's knees. While it was still rising, it suddenly flowed outwards. In the eyes of the cultivators outside the 1,000 dust mountains, a true wave suddenly appeared at the edge of the 1,000 dust mountains, washing out towards the wasteland in all directions. In the sky, Zhengyan bounced up dozens of feet with a pale face. Her body trembled slightly. Some vital energy uncontrollably passed through her meridians, causing some damage to her body. She even tasted blood that had not appeared in her memory for many years. But compared to such insignificant injuries, the ripples in her mind were even more terrifying. These serpents had not died, and she had completely lost control of them. The people on the ground looked at the shocked Jiaodong Commandery monster in the sky. No one attacked, but her full-power, heaven-containing sphere was easily blocked. Even Qin Yaoyin's six-winged golden cicada had temporarily avoided the terrifying collision of energy. Everyone understood how she felt at this moment. "You are very lucky." Ding Ning could not help but smile. Then he said softly to Zhang Sun Qinxue, "Qin Yaoyin and the others, the Master of Fire has also come." "The Master of Fire?" Zhang Sun Qinxue, Qin Yaoyin, and the others frowned. While even they had not sensed the presence of the Master of Fire, since Ding Ning said so, he would not be wrong. A feeling of good fortune surfaced in their hearts. The Master of Fire had appeared at the last moment of the Battle of Chongling, and then became famous in one battle. The method he cultivated was very strange. His vital energy gathered the primal energies of the universe to form the fire that seemed to burn all primal energies of the universe. Other than this, no matter if it was his body or his use of sword manuals, he was not unique. But this was enough. From a certain point of view, other than Zheng Xiu and Yuanwu needing him to ensure the destruction of the 9-death silkworm, before his vital energy ran out, the other cultivators could not kill him, and could only use up vital energy against him. This kind of opponent was not terrifying to some of the top Realm 7s, but very difficult to deal with. Restrain Zheng Yin, kill the Master of Fire first. Ding Ning turned to look at Yantai Guanjian and said slowly, "Since vital energy cannot kill the Master of Fire, then we need real blades. I need you to take me to him." Yantai Guanjian stilled slightly. He instinctively thought, Has your vital energy mostly recovered? However, in the next breath, he instantly reacted. Since it was a real blade, then he did not need much vital energy. Also, in terms of sword moves, he feared no one in the world could compare to Ding Ning. He nodded and looked at Ding Ning. You only need to tell me when to attack. Do not treasure vital energy, Ding Ning said calmly. The Master of Fire is also very difficult to deal with. He is skilled in disguise and concealment, and can even imitate the presence of some cultivators. A cultivator of the Zhao sword furnace died at his hands. So if we cannot kill him this time, we will be frightened in the future, and I fear we will never be able to kill him again. An enormous boom sounded in the sky again. Amidst the earth-shaking collisions, there was the sound of some extremely hard objects exploding. This sound was as crisp as the sound of gemstones colliding with each other. The soaring snakes and Zheng in the sky had started their second round of fighting. In the endless wind and rain, there was a blinding crystal light in Zheng An's hand. It was a deep blue spear. Her face was still pale, but her old body contained terrifying power like the Donghu monk. Like the legendary sea gods suddenly appearing, the spear pierced through the heads of the two soaring snakes and lifted their enormous bodies onto the tip of the spear. This was a soul-stirring scene, but Ding Ning was still extremely calm. So calm that even Yintai Guanjian found it terrifying. Now, Ding Ning said to him. Yintai Guanjian still did not sense where the Master of Fire was among the dust mountains, but he did not hesitate to move his sword. Because at this time, a thread of vital energy released by Ding Ning pointed him in the direction. A blinding sword light appeared in the wind and rain. This sword light surpassed the speed of all the lightning in the wind and rain. There was an explosion. Rainwater was pressed together to form a crystal wall, and then two figures suddenly appeared on the crystal wall. The moment these two figures appeared in the eyes of the red-robed Master of Fire, the crystal wall had already been penetrated, and a terrifying sword light had already reached his throat. A moment ago, the Master of Fire had been watching the play. Since he and Crown Prince Hugo were only responsible for the end, then he and Crown Prince Hugo did not need to act at this time. He thought that this old monster of Jiaodong Commandery could take care of this group of cultivators who had reached their limits. But in the next moment, he was close to true death. His body's instinctive reaction surpassed his thoughts. The Jade Palace in his energy sea started to convulse furiously and forced his vital energy to erupt. With a puff, he spat out a deep red flame from his mouth, just like the legendary beasts with true fire in their bodies. Chapter 662. This flame had completely turned into a tangible object, condensed into a crimson gem, shining with a dazzling and translucent light. When it collided with this incomparably fast sword light, there were instantly countless crisp and fine cracking sounds, as if a hard crystal was exploding. However, in the next moment, there was a loud explosion. Every piece of crystal turned into a huge fire that burned toward the sword in front of him. Fine and vast were relative concepts. Each seal script on the sword was just a thin line for ordinary people, but in the perception of cultivators, they could be wide rivers or even plains. At this time, the flames from the Lai Huajinren's mouth came into contact with an icy and cold energy between the rivers and plains. Then, they swept past without stopping, as if they were easily burning hay. Yintai Guanjian's figure clearly appeared in the air. He encountered a great resistance. His entire body and sword light stopped in the air. In his perception, these flames swept over extremely quickly, about to enter his body through the sword in his hand, and then burn away all of his vital essence and qi and blood. However, he overcame the natural fear in his heart. Instead, he unreservedly poured all of the remaining vital energy in his body into the sword in his hand. The flame easily burned the hay, and he seemed to have piled countless hay on top of it to meet the flame. There was another great boom in front of him. The seal scripts on his sword could not contain such astounding energy. In a moment, a terrifying storm exploded between the two along the edges of the seal scripts. Both he and Master Fire let out a muffled moan, as both of their bodies were sent flying backward uncontrollably. The true fire gushed out from the runes, but it continued to spread forward, toward his body. Only when it reached the sword hilt did Yintai Guanjian release his fingers and decisively abandon his sword. There was no vital energy left in his body. His body continued to fly backwards with the help of the terrifying impact. The Master of Fire's eyes turned blood red like true fire was about to spill out. He stared at Yintai Guanjian, who was flying backwards, his heart full of murderousness. Because the method he cultivated was special, in the past many years, very few people had tried to kill him, and no one had ever made him so close to death. At this time, Yintai Guanjian's vital energy was cut off. There seemed to be a natural barrier between his flying body and his true fire. But he still had power. With a thought, he should be able to kill Yintai Guanjian, who was unable to fight back. But at this time, he felt a chill on his back. This was a direct feeling. It was only when he felt a chill on his back that he felt an even stronger threat of death than before. It was only then that he felt pain and fear. He had been hit. With a sharp scream, his body arched forward and bounced out, avoiding the sword that had stabbed from the left side of his back and into his heart. The crimson crystal fire naturally flowed out along with the blood in his body. This was his most direct counterattack. As long as this person's sword touched his true fire, unless they abandoned their sword, they would be killed by him. What infuriated him the most was that in his perception, this person did not even have Realm 7 power, but was able to stab him. How is this possible? But what he had not expected was that in this moment, a piece seemed to be missing from his body. It was as if a piece of a perfect jigsaw puzzle was suddenly missing. The true fire flowing out of his energy, he could not follow his thoughts to the wound on his back. The missing piece in his body came from a new wave of coldness. More accurately, in his perception, it was the tip of a sword. At this instant, he was struck once more. This sword had pierced through an extremely important meridian point in his body. It hadn't penetrated very deeply, but even he didn't know that this meridian point could actually affect the circulation of true essence in his body. This happened in a fraction of a breath. He was hit twice. Because of the strong emotional fluctuations, his flesh did not have time to convulse and tremble, but his body was filled with an uncomfortable feeling. This was because the energies in his organs were out of balance, and the obstruction to the flow of vital energy had hindered his own adjustment. Yet a kind of understanding only now appeared in his mind. Just now, the other sword had pierced through his skin and had not even made true contact with the blood under his skin. The extremely fast sword and the sharp sword essence had naturally stimulated the energy, blood, and vital energy in his body. Like a skin bag, the other had just made a light cut on the surface and had not truly cut it, but the pressure coming from inside and out had caused the crack to open and explode. What sword move was this? What kind of person could use the sword like this? What kind of person could instantly stab him twice at Realm 6 and seal one of his meridian points? Among the shrill screams, he felt that his voice was unfamiliar. His face twisted, and he turned around according to his perception. Then he saw the other's figure clearly. That person was walking through the flames on his body and moving through the fire clouds. That person was a youth with an extremely calm expression. In this moment, a bit of coldness came from his right rib. This bit of coolness was like an ice-cold flower blooming in his scorching chi sea. This time he saw it clearly. The shadow of the sword retracted as soon as it touched his body. Then, he clearly saw his own chi and blood spurt out from under his right rib. Then, he felt pain and terror. Once again, he was sure that his body's instinctive reaction had caused his chi and blood to open up the wound. When he saw this youth who had stabbed him 3 times, he understood the other's identity, and that what Yuanwu said was true. Only that person back then could use a sword like this. Most terrifying of all, from the other's flowing movements and the sword light and shadow that came with the sword, he smelled an unusually familiar scent. His heart contracted violently, and there seemed to be countless people screaming in his body. To deal with such an existence, he could only use pure vital energy to crush him. He wanted to spit out the true fire in his energy sea and cover the world in his sight and wrap around this youth. But the vital energy that was usually more obedient to his thoughts than his hands and feet was like waves hitting the shore in his body, surging but unable to flow smoothly. The meridian point under his right rib was broken, and another meridian was broken. He was like a giant trapped in a spot. He had the strength, but could not smash it out. Ding Ning breathed calmly. Even though he was moving beyond his usual limits, all of his body's techniques were coordinated to the extreme. He was like a gust of wind that did not have a fixed trajectory. In the moment the Master of Fire paused, he arrived at his side. With a flip of his hand, he lightly tapped the Master of Fire's energy sea. Chapter 663. There was a cold and piercing pain on the skin above his energy sea. The Master of Fire knew that he was at the last line of death before this sword arrived. Based on his previous experience, he forcibly restrained all of his vital energy in his energy sea and did not let it out. He gave a muffled grunt, and strange sounds came from his bones. This kind of instinctive reaction of forcibly restraining one's body, for a cultivator, was as uncomfortable as being pressed hard on their body. However, with a pu sound, the cold and piercing pain continued to penetrate into his flesh. This sword was not like before, where it had only touched and then retracted. Instead, it continued to penetrate, truly piercing through his flesh and into his energy sea. Crown Prince Hugo. The Master of Fire howled like a wounded wild beast. A hole appeared in his energy sea. Precious vital energy spilled out of the hole, but was not under his control. If he encountered the attack of other low-level cultivators, even if he could not use his vital energy, he could use his sword move to deal with it and stop the other's killing move. But he was facing a person who could easily defeat the sword moves of all the sects in the world. He knew that only Crown Prince Hugo could save his life. When Ding Ning's sword stabbed into the Master of Fire's energy sea, and before the Master of Fire howled, the Donghu monk who had been sitting on the ground with his eyes closed sensed danger and suddenly opened his eyes. His injuries caused his body to be on the verge of collapse, and he could not use any power. But he was the second true realm aid in the world. His thoughts still pulled on a thread of primal energies of the universe. While he did not have true power, a cultivator hiding in the formation and preparing to attack sensed a strange presence. This cultivator hiding in the formation was naturally Crown Prince Hugo. His hair stood on end like a frightened wildcat. The presence that was completely sealed in his body was slightly exposed, and a layer of cold wind blew around him. Qian Mu exclaimed. He also sensed this familiar energy. Then Qing Yaoyin. When he suddenly became alert, his gaze and perception left Jiaodong Commandery, Zheng, and in the sky. The next moment, when the Master of Fire's crazy howls like a wounded beast reached everyone's ears, his figure had already disappeared from where he was and appeared on the left side behind Ding Ning. Puff! It was the same sound as when Master of Fire's Sea of Qi was pierced. He turned around and stood with his back facing Ding Ning. A black dagger appeared in his left hand, and he stabbed at the air in front of him. A ray of light appeared in the empty air, following the direction of his sword light. Crown Prince Hugo's figure appeared there, covered in white armor like a skeletal divine general. Crown Prince Hugo's cold eyes rippled with a strange emotion. It was like praise, but more like sympathy and pity. A dot of blue flame appeared where Qing Yaoyin's short sword was pointing. That was the shadow of a small skeleton, but it had a dark and cold power that did not belong to this world. Qing Yaoyin's sword seemed to stab into an unknown space. The seal scripts on the sword were restrained and attacked by countless ghostly energies like thousands of ghosts were charging into the seal scripts. Crown Prince Hugo did not give off any presence. That small skeleton shadow was like a substitute for him and attracted all the perception and attention for him. The moment Qing Yaoyin's sword was restrained, his hand hit Qing Yaoyin's body. Ear-piercing explosions sounded in Qing Yaoyin's body. Even though the vital energy in his energy sea surged out, and the vast amounts of energy in the world gathered in front of his chest, his bones still seemed to be crushed by mountains and could not withstand it. His sternum shattered, and then even his spine could not withstand this kind of power and cracked. Qing Yaoyin sprayed out of his mouth. His body flew back into the dust mountain behind him like a kite with its string cut. The exchange of blows in this moment did not escape Ding Ning's perception. His body was close to the edge of the collision of the two's power. His body swayed in the wild wind, but his steps and sword were not disrupted. Even his mind maintained absolute calmness. Qing Yaoyin had spent more than a decade on the Nether Dragon. Crown Prince Hugo was naturally one of the few experts in the world, and one that was hard to predict. But even so, Ding Ning did not feel that Qing Yaoyin would be so easily sent flying by Crown Prince Hugo's hand, or killed. The great punishment sword in his hand was touched by the fire of the Master of Fire's energy sea. So, he simply released the hilt and grabbed the other sword at his waist. A patch of blinding white flowers sprayed in front of the Master of Fire's face. These white flowers appeared soft, but pierced the Master of Fire's eyes, and even blocked his perception. He could not see Ding Ning's position, or Ding Ning's attack. The fine white flowers bloomed wildly in the air, colliding with each other and creating more flowers. Seeing Ding Ning and the Master of Fire moving quickly in the dust, and seeing the fine white flowers that sputtered in front of the Master of Fire, Fu Su suddenly realized something, and his body stiffened. At the same time, Crown Prince Hugo also stiffened. He had sent Qing Yaoyin flying with a palm. He raised the white bone staff in his hand and was about to point towards Ding Ning's back. But at this time, half of his body lost feeling. He didn't even feel anything strange. He didn't even feel any qi that made him feel uncomfortable. Half of his body no longer belonged to him. Even the true essence flowing in his body seemed to have gone to another place that didn't belong to him. He was shocked. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw that his hand on Qing Yaoyin's body had turned green, and there were dots of green light coming out of his skin like strange fireflies growing in his body. His breathing suddenly stopped. Both sides were wounded. In this moment, he realized that Qing Yaoyin had purposefully used a method that would cause both sides to be wounded. With a boom, Qing Yaoyin landed heavily on the ground. Blood sprayed out of his body, and he looked wretched. But looking at such a wretched body, Crown Prince Hugo's eyes no longer held any pride or pity, only deep terror. His vision blurred at this moment. The world in front of him turned a wretched green. What kind of poison was this that even his vital energy could not stop it from spreading? At this time, the Master of Fire gave another shrill scream. Ding Ning's last flower remnant sword stabbed into his body again. This time it was his back behind his energy sea. Chapter 664. The wound on his back was not deep, and did not truly penetrate his energy sea. Yet even the Master of Fire did not know, or rather, only now did he know, that this was an important meridian point in his body that circulated his meridians. The Master of Fire pressed a hand against his energy sea, wanting to stop the vital energy from pouring out of his energy sea. It was just a slight pressure, with a light pop, as if the venerable Lai who had used his palm to break an eggshell. The wound on his back immediately exploded outwards. The wound connected from front to back. Crimson-red vital energy did not just charge out of the wound on his back like a sharp sword. It also passed through the disrupted meridians in his body. This vital energy was usually docile in his body, nourishing his body like spirit medicines. Yet at this time he felt great pain and burning. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw that every inch of his meridians gave off a fiery light. He was so terrified that he was about to cry. He knew he was about to die. His entire body was about to be burned to ash by the fire created by his vital energy. At this time, he was 100% certain that this young person holding the last flower remnant sword was that person from back then. The others seemed to have purposefully used such a method to have him taste the feeling of being burned to death by his own fire. This was a true case of giving others a taste of their own medicine. Those who play with fire will burn themselves. In the next moment, he was filled with regret and felt he was an idiot. Back then, while he had burned that person to ash with his fire, that was when that person had used up all of his power and could not even defeat an ordinary person. He faintly remembered that person sitting on the mountain of powerful cultivators' corpses and unable to charge. Many people had been chilled by the killing and did not dare to advance, including him. When a low-level cultivator's flying sword pierced through that person's body, he finally dared to attack and release his fire. Yet after more than a decade, he actually forgot those scenes and became an idiot. While this person could still wield a sword, he had come confidently to collect the corpse. He was hopelessly stupid. He knew that he was going to die soon. His lips and teeth were filled with indescribable bitterness. However, at this moment, Ding Ning's voice entered his ears. "Do you still want to live?" Without any hesitation, he nodded his head with all his might. It was a reaction of his body and mind. The more powerful a cultivator like him was, the harder it was to obtain his cultivation. Who knew how much hard work he had to go through, how many difficult choices he had to make, and how many things he had to give up. Therefore, the more powerful a cultivator was, the more afraid they were of death. They were like those rich people in the mortal world who possessed countless riches. Before they died, they would use countless spirit medicines to keep themselves alive. Even if they were in extreme pain, they were unwilling to leave this world. His response was completely within Ding Ning's expectations. Many cultivators' life trajectories were already determined the moment they confirmed their cultivation method and went deep into it. The leaf fire that the Master of Fire cultivated was a method that burned his vital energy to fight against the other. While this meant that some cultivators stronger than him were not willing to use their cultivation to kill him, and made him unusually difficult to deal with, from another point of view, this was a method that was especially afraid of death, especially when no one was willing to kill him. He had experienced fewer life and death situations than most grandmasters of the same realm. Many years ago in Chongling, he had seen through this old monster Li Hua. Ding Ning did not say anything else. He attacked again. The sword threads of the last flower remnant sword split apart, turning into many thin needles that pierced into the Master of Fire's body. The Master of Fire immediately felt his body turn cold. Then he found in shock and terror that his meridians that had been sealed by Ding Ning's sword had been opened. But they were flowing in a path that he was unfamiliar with. Or rather, Ding Ning's attack seemed to have reorganized his meridians and caused his body to have more channels and circulations that he could not understand. The vital energy in his energy seemed naturally stopped moving chaotically. The feeling of Realm 7 power returned to his body. In this moment, he felt he had the power to kill Ding Ning. But this feeling of facing a cultivator weaker than him only appeared for a moment. In the next moment, a feeling of terror caused by this thought caused him to break out in a cold sweat. He woke up. He felt that this feeling of power in his body seemed to have a connection to Ding Ning. It seemed that Ding Ning could give it at any time, but also take it at any time. He froze on the ground, not knowing what to do. At this time, Crown Prince Yugo screamed. His eyes were completely blind. Even the pale green color had disappeared from his world. Everything in front of him was pitch black. He could not suppress the corrosion of the poison in his body. Even more importantly, the poison had completely invaded his senses and caused him to have many illusions. He could not sense the existence of Ding Ning, Qing Yaoyin, and the others. He only saw strange shapes and even dead enemies that he had killed moving around him. "How are you?" Qianmu sprinted to Qing Yaoyin's side. Looking at Qing Yaoyin, whose body was almost twisted, he froze. "I won't die for now. I've already used medicine, but you have to help me set my bones. Otherwise, even if I don't die, the bones in my body will become a mess, and I won't be human." Qing Yaoyin wanted to squeeze out a smile, but he couldn't. The bone fragments in his body caused him to think of the messy grass in the plains. Before fighting Crown Prince Yugo, he had no chance of victory. He could only use such a method, so before the fight, he had already taken medicine. Fortunately, Crown Prince Yugo had underestimated him. His plan had succeeded. Qianmu squatted down and stopped thinking about the outside world. He started to search for the broken bones in Qing Yaoyin's body and then put them together. He was very young, but he was very focused. Yantai Guanjin coughed up blood. His situation was slightly better than Qing Yaoyin. This fastest swordsman in the world could not even stand up. Qing Yaoyin used such a method to defeat Crown Prince Yugo, who was most likely the most difficult of the invaders. He did not even have a chance to use the other's ghostly methods. But now, the danger had not passed. The greatest danger came from the sky. Ding Ning looked up. A shadow as big as a mountain was falling. These soaring snakes could not stop the old woman from Jiaodong Commandery in the sky. Another soaring snake was killed. What truly held her back was still Qing Yaoyin's power, and his six-winged golden cicada. But now, Zheng Yan's figure was floating down with the falling serpent. She left the strange crane steed under her, and ignored the battle between the strange crane and the six-winged golden cicada. She headed straight for Ding Ning. Chapter 665. You are just afraid of death. Back then, fortunately, you only escaped the pursuit of the Bazin Kindo ground, and did not help Zheng Xiu kill the people of the Bazin Kindo ground. So I do not blame you. Today, you helped me through this crisis. This is equivalent to helping me live. The grievances between us are over. Ding Ning started to speak. He looked calmly at Zheng, and who was falling from the sky, and spoke to the Master of Fire. Inexplicably, when he heard Ding Ning's first words, the Master of Fire suddenly felt relaxed. All the remaining vital energy in his energy sea flowed along the new meridians in his body, as though guided by the words, and charged towards Ding Ning's life-bond sword. Ding Ning had put away the last flower remnant sword. He gripped the great punishment sword whose fire had been extinguished but whose blade was still boiling hot. The Master of Fire was shocked, but he suddenly understood why. He thought of Yuan Wu's power at the Deer Mountain Conference. He thought of how, at the most crucial moment, Huang Jinwei's vital energy seemed to have been guided by Yuan Wu's mind and was used by him. This method should have come from Yuan Wu. In the past, Yuan Wu knew most of Wang Jingming's methods and secrets other than the 9-death silkworm, because they had once been brothers. Wang Jingming's contribution to Yuan Wu was no different from his contribution to Bailey Sushue. No matter if it was the exchange of methods or the comprehension of cultivation experience. So many Chongling cultivators loyal to Yuan Wu had to admit that a large part of the reason Yuan Wu was able to have a breakthrough in the decade after ascending the throne and become the first cultivator to reach Realm 8 in this era was likely because of Wang Jingming. Wang Jingming was like a brother and teacher to Yuan Wu. So when Yuan Wu and Zheng Xiu worked together to deal with Wang Jingming, in the view of the Master of Fire, Wang Jingming would undoubtedly die. But now he thought about it the other way around. For a long time, Wang Jingming also understood Yuan Wu. At this time, the vital energy coming out of the Master of Fire's energy seemed to have nothing to do with him. Even though he was thinking about Yuan Wu and Wang Jingming in such a chaotic state of mind, the vital energy flowing out of his body flowed smoothly. The remaining sword essences and meridians of the last flower remnant swords that had stabbed into his body were like a formation that perfectly simulated Yuan Wu's methods, and even better. The Master of Fire neglected one point. The most terrifying thing about Wang Jingming back then, other than being the best in the world at using the sword, was that when he started to attack, a battle was like a strategist to him. He had already planned what the next sword would be after this sword strike. Just like at this moment, the moment he gave up on killing the Master of Fire, he had already prepared this sword. Ding Ning's body began to sink. Zheng Yin, who was falling from the sky, was extremely old. This oldest cultivator of Jiaodong Commandery did not seem to weigh much, but her old and thin body contained terrifying power. But the wild wind formed by the energy when she fell was like an enormous wall pressing down on Ding Ning's body, causing his feet to sink into the soft ground soaked in blood. The remaining soaring snakes stirred up wind and rain as they chased after her from behind. However, the power that attacked her pushed her forward instead. Because her own Yuan Qi was very compatible, a portion of it posed no threat to her and was instead used by her. The crimson-red vital energy flowing out of the Master of Fire's body turned into crystal ribbons in the air and gathered on the Great Punishment Sword in his hand. The Great Punishment Sword in his hand started to burn. He did not make any extra movements. He just raised his sword slightly, and the ruby-like flames on the sword burned away the wild wind coming down from above. His body lightened, and he felt no pressure. Then he swung his sword, and slashed at Zheng and who was very close to him. The Great Punishment Sword was the strongest sword he pursued. The primal energies of the universe in the sword were very strong. But as they surged out, they did not have any violent presence. Even the fire formed from the vital energy of the Master of Fire gathered together into a thin line. This sword move was called One-Line Sky. This was one of his strongest sword essences, and the sword move he had used to kill Liang Lian in the past. For example, water flow was a very soft thing, but when it was compressed to a thin line with terrifying speed, this thin line could cut through metal. Back then, his cultivation had been far from Liang Lian's, but he had defeated Liang Lian with this sword. Also, this sword was the realm's 7 power of the Master of Fire, and the fire that could burn all the vital energy in the world. Other than realm 8s like Yuanwu and the Donghu monk who could withstand his sword. Seeing the formation of such a thin line, Zhengyan in the sky couldn't help but let out an uncontrollable cry that sounded like a crow's cry. Even though the Master of Fire and Crown Prince Hugo had been defeated, in her eyes, when Yintai Guanjian and Qing Yaoyin had no power to fight, Ding Ning was a dead man. She had never thought that Ding Ning could use such a terrifying sword move. What was the difference between this sword strike and that person's attack back then? Amidst her hysterical screams, a bit of crystal light appeared in her chi si. A sparkling ball flew out and blocked in front of her. This was the Zhe pill she had nourished with her life's energy. The longer a life bond item was nourished, the stronger it would be. This was the accumulation of time. She likely had lived longer than all the cultivators in the world. The power of this life bond item naturally surpassed the imagination of most Realm 7 Grandmasters. But there was a soft crack. A crack appeared on the hibernating pill. When the entire Thousand Mountain formation shook violently, the hibernating pill split into 2 pieces. The scattered energy even instantly sent several flying serpents that were close to it. This was still not enough to stop this sword. When Zheng and used this life bond item, she was going all out. Her body moved through the air, and in a moment, she seemed to smash through many crystal walls. Her afterimage created sonic booms. Invisible white lotus-like shockwaves spread. But back then, all the Realm 7s had not been able to withstand Wang Jingming's sword. Now, this sword had the power of Wang Jingming's past peak. How could Ding Ning let it miss? This sword line still landed on Zheng An's body. All of Zheng An's efforts only prevented this sword line from completely cutting through her body. A red line appeared on the right side of her body. Half of her right shoulder and right leg had been cut open along with a small part of her body. As the blood gushed out, the white bone stubble seemed to be stuck together. It looked more terrifying and disgusting than death. Chapter 666. Zheng continued to scream in pain. That small half of her body was completely separated from her body. However, her figure still retreated into the dust mountain behind her. Blood was still dense in the air, but her figure instantly disappeared. Seeing this scene, the Master of Fire almost knelt down. This blow was like Wang Jingming's peak in the past. While most of it came from his power, thinking of Wang Jingming's accumulated power, if Wang Jingming had not died after killing so many people and appeared in front of the cultivators who had seen him fight back then, most likely all of these cultivators would feel the same as he did. The grudge between you and me has been settled. However, you can only leave this formation after it disappears. Ding Ning did not look at him. He looked at where Zheng and had disappeared, and his brows furrowed involuntarily. A small half of her body had been cut open, and her organs and meridians were fatally wounded. But he sensed that Zheng was still using vital energy to gather primal energies of the universe to seal her wounds. Zheng would die in the end. But in the world of cultivators, there were many examples of people who could fight for a while after their bodies were cut open, until their vital energy ran out and they died. Right now, Zheng did not just need to suppress the flow of vital energy and blood in her body. What she needed to suppress most was the indescribable terror of her body being cut open. If she appears again, none of us will be able to stop her. Zhang Sun Qinxue came close to him and said softly to him, If she has to die, someone like her will not be willing to die like this. It is just a matter of time before she overcomes her terror. She will appear again and attack. Ding Ning listened to Zhang Sun Qinshue's words. He thought inside he was still a bit off. The Master of Fire's vital energy was not his own. Then he took a deep breath and said slowly, "We are still missing one person. Someone who should come has not appeared." His words stilled everyone present, including the Master of Fire. Crown Prince Hugo is someone I did not expect. Ding Ning turned to look at Crown Prince Hugo. Crown Prince Hugo had been poisoned to the point where he lost all his senses. He couldn't even make a sound. His skin and flesh began to fester and fall off. When a cultivator was unable to suppress the spread of poison in their body, and even their vital essence was corroded, the only outcome was death. After living in seclusion for so long, he had traveled thousands of miles to court death. Everyone felt that this matter was very ironic, but they did not understand who Ding Ning was missing. Crown Prince Hugo is called the Crown Prince, but he has not been Crown Prince for even a day. Now, it seems that he hates me and the Bazin Kendo ground more than Zheng Xiu and Yuan Wu. But now, even without me and the Bazin Kendo ground, how can someone like him fight against Yuan Wu and Zheng Xiu? The people of Chongling and the other commanderies of the Qin dynasty needed a bright emperor like Yuan Wu, and not a demon king shrouded in yin energy. Back then, when he chose his method, he did not even understand this. How could he have received the support of the important people of Chongling? Ding Ning looked away and said directly, "I originally thought that it would be Meng Fangying who came in with the people of Jiaodong Commandery, and not this Crown Prince Hugo." The Master of Fire's heart jumped. Even he immediately reacted. Especially Fu Su, whose emotions were complicated at this time, changed expression. Meng Fangying was Meng Qihai's father, Marquis Meng. Zheng Xiu's only cousin, Zheng Fei, was married to Marquis Meng. So everyone knew that of the 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty, Marquis Meng and Zheng Xiu were the closest. From a certain point of view, Marquis Meng was one of Zheng Xiu's confidants. What she paid was a marriage alliance and part of the benefits of Jiaodong Commandery. Killing the 9-Death Silkworm was Zheng Xiu's greatest goal in the Spring War against the Chu. At this time, multiple marquises had died on the battlefields of Yin Mountain and Yangshan Commandery. There were reports that Marquis Meng had come to Yin Mountain, but he had not appeared on the battlefield. Where could he have gone? Meng Fangying's personality is similar to Zheng Xiu's. He will not appear unless he is confident. So he is deeply trusted by Zheng Xiu. Ding Ning looked down and said coldly. When his expression changed, a cold and authoritative voice sounded. "As expected, you know me well." At the same time this cold and authoritative voice sounded, Crown Prince Hugo stumbled and his rotting body was shattered by a powerful force. Pieces of pale green debris fell into the depths of the dust mountain, like thousands of sharp arrows. Crown Prince Hugo has an empty title and does not know he has stolen it. But he is still of the imperial family. At least, he has to die cleanly and leave some respect. A middle-aged man dressed in the robes of the Marquis dynasty appeared from the dust mountain. His hair was covered in dust, but his face was still handsome. But his arms outside of his sleeves gave people a feeling of being as hard as metal. Some of the wounds on his skin looked like they had been cut by blades, but the healed wounds seemed to be covered by metal and even flashed with a cold light. He had originally been an eagle breeder in the border army. The eagles he raised were used to pass on military intelligence. But he had spent more than 20 years climbing from the bottom of the border army to the top of Chongling, becoming a marquis of the Qin dynasty, and married another famous beauty of Jiaodong Commandery, Zheng Fei. "You are Wang Jingming." Meng Fangying looked deeply at Ding Ning and then said, "The Holy One is right. You are not the heir to the 9-Death Silkworm, but his rebirth." Ding Ning looked at this familiar man and did not respond. At this time, there was no meaning in thinking about any response. The key was inside and outside the dust mountain. Who could stop Zheng Xiu's pawn, the final winner? Lin Zhujiu and Zhang Shiwu did not have time. They had originally been in the Chu capital, and their focus had been on ensuring that the Chu capital would not fall into chaos, and that Consort Zhao would not die. Do you have any last words? Meng Fangying put away his faint smile and glanced at Zhangsun Qinxue. Then he looked seriously at Ding Ning and suggested, or maybe you can speak of the secret of the 9-death silkworm. This way, I may let everyone here die more easily. Even if I speak of the secret of the 9-death silkworm, do you dare to listen? Ding Ning suddenly smiled and said with slight disdain, even if you hear it from me, and then tell Zheng Xiu, will Zheng Xiu allow anyone in the world other than her to know the secret of the 9-death silkworm? Meng Fangying suddenly stilled and felt cold inside. Chapter 667. Is Yishina stronger, or are you stronger? Ding Ning looked calmly at Meng Fangying and asked. Meng Fangying's expression changed again. He said harshly, what do you mean? Come in, I die, you come out alive. Have you thought clearly about what will happen in the future? Ding Ning's expression did not change. He just calmly stated a fact. If you and Yi Xinhe compete in swords, you should be the one to die, and not Yi Xinhe. Then why did you come, and not Yi Xinhe? Do not tell me that Yi Xinhe has other matters in Chongling. Nothing is more important than destroying the 9-death silkworm. Ding Ning looked at Meng Fangying, whose lips were moving. He did not give him a chance to speak and said, you said that I understand Zheng Xiu very well. In my view, to completely destroy the 9-death silkworm, she will only use one method, to have anyone who comes into contact with the 9-death silkworm die. Meng Fangying's eyes narrowed. He said coldly, absurd. Zheng En is about to die of old age, and the Master of Fire is not one of her people. As for Crown Prince Yugo, I fear it is best for him to die. Ding Ning said disdainfully, if you believe that these people are chess pieces that will die, but you can live alone and live well, then you only need to convince yourself. Meng Fangying took a deep breath, his expression dark. Before he could react, the Master of Fire, who had heard clearly from the side, was covered in cold sweat. He felt that Ding Ning was right, and said it simply and clearly. However, he had not thought of this before. Meng Fangying was silent for a moment. Then he looked up and said, according to what you say, I came to see you, but I can only die. Ding Ning looked calmly at him and did not directly answer his question. He said, there is a question that you have not thought of in these years. Why did most of the 13 marquises of the Qin dynasty choose to stand on Zheng Xiu's side and not the side of the Bazinkendo ground? Meng Fangying's heart jumped, but he did not immediately speak. If the marquises live forever, what is the difference between them and the old nobility of the past? It wasn't easy to defeat those old aristocratic families, but in the end, more aristocratic families were born. Ding Ning said slowly but clearly, even the powerful Yu dynasty that ruled the world back then was a rebellion by 7 titled kings. While they were pacified, the Yu dynasty was greatly weakened and gave more rebels hope. Back then, the Bazinkendo ground only wanted a highly centralized central dynasty, not many marquises. That is why many of you cooperated with Yuan Wu to mutiny against the Bazinkendo ground. But in these years, have you really not thought that while Zheng Xiu and Yuan Wu, other than the Bazinkendo ground, everything else is following the path of the Bazinkendo ground? Because only such a central dynasty can allow their power to reach the peak and establish an everlasting foundation. In this battle, even if the 9-death silkworm is destroyed, the 9-death silkworm will be destroyed. But how many marquee manors will be left? Ding Ning smiled faintly. How many marquee manors will disappear from the Yin Mountain battlefield and the Yangshan commandery battlefield? The flickering light in the dust mountain fell on Meng Fangying's body. His eyelashes trembled. He was silent for a moment before he said, I admit that what you said is very reasonable. Ding Ning looked at him. And then? And then you will still die, and I will still kill you. Meng Fangying took a deep breath and said seriously and emotionally, no matter what Zheng Xiu thinks, you and I were enemies many years ago in Chongling. Just like night and day, we cannot coexist. Ding Ning just looked at him and did not speak. So after saying so much, I will still kill you. Meng Fangying looked at Ding Ning and said, but saying all this is not meaningless. At least it reminded me of some things I should be wary of, so I must thank you." Ding Ning suddenly laughed and said, "Other than this, there is more important meaning." Meng Fangying stilled slightly and had a bad feeling. "It wasn't easy for me to mention these things in order to delay you. Finally, I managed to get someone to come, and it's someone I really like to see." Ding Ning sighed in relief. His vest was completely soaked. When he had said those words, he had been very close to death. Meng Fangying suddenly turned around. In this moment, he still had the confidence to kill Ding Ning, but he sensed true danger. He did not want to die, so he had to ensure his own safety. In the flickering dust shadow behind him, a thin and tall figure appeared along with a wave of air. Ding Ning had two swords, the last flower and the great punishment. This tall and thin figure also had two swords. One sword had an exceptionally long hilt that was held horizontally in front of his chest. The other was an ordinary white jade sword that hung at his waist. Meng Fangying did not recognize this person, but when he saw the white jade sword, he immediately thought of this person's identity. At this time, Ding Ning had retreated far away behind him. Then he bowed to the newcomer, his voice filled with unspeakable joy. "Sect Uncle, Li Daoji." Meng Fangying shouted this person's name. This person and his cultivation place were not famous in the past, and were not even famous in Chongling. But in this winter, the sect master of this cultivation place, Shui Wangshu, reached Realm 7 and defeated General Liang Lian. This cultivation place was White Goat Cave. The White Goat Cave that Zheng Xiu had ordered to close. White Goat Cave produced a genius like Ding Ning and became famous. Zhang Yi, Su Qin, Li Daoji, these important people of White Goat Cave were known by the cultivators of Chongling. "Just you?" Meng Fangying suddenly laughed coldly. While Ding Ning had used his words to stall for time until a person came, this was just a cultivator of White Goat Cave. When he left Chongling in the past, he had only been Realm 6. Even if he was Realm 7 now, how could he be a match for him? This is not a matter of strength. Since I am holding the sword of the sect master of White Goat Cave, I am the sect master of White Goat Cave. Li Daoji appeared thinner, older, and colder compared to the past in Chongling. Since I am his sect uncle, I will attack. Also, I do not have to defeat you with my strength. Before I entered the formation, I saw a sword light in the distance. After a pause, Li Daoji looked at Meng Fangying and said, "While I have left Chongling for a long time, I still recognize that sword light as Feng Ho Province's shining sky light, the sword light that Feng Ho Province uses to send orders." Meng Fangying's breathing suddenly stopped. "Feng Shimu!" Yantai Guanjin shouted in joy. Chapter 668. Tantai Guanjin was rarely so happy, but he was very happy right now. Of course, he did not want to die. For him, Feng Shimu was the kind of person who could guarantee they would not die if they arrived in time. The only person who could represent Feng Ho Province to send out a sword light could only be Feng Shimu. Meng Fangying was silent for a moment. He knew Feng Shimu's importance, but he still raised his head slightly. He looked at the light coming down from the dust mountains, and his lips curled stubbornly. In the past, when I was flying eagles on the border, I did not think too much. I came from the border army. I only thought that this empire could unify the world like the Yu dynasty in the past and establish an unparalleled empire. If I could become a general, my name would go down in history. Back then, I did not care who won in the Chongling nobility. Today, my thoughts have not changed. I am not like you. You care about revenge, but I only want to destroy you, destroy the Chu dynasty, and the Qin dynasty will have no opponents. The grudges of immortals are different from the thoughts of mortals, and mortals outnumber immortals. Since you've already lost back then, it's even more impossible for you to win now. After a pause, he looked down at Ding Ning and Li Daoji. He said slowly, "Even if it is Feng Shimu, what can he change? Since you can see his sword light, my 3 eagles can also see his sword light. Also, the key is, how long can you stop me?" When he said the last words, his gaze stopped on Ding Ning. This was a kind of wariness. He had seen how Ding Ning had borrowed the vital energy of the Master of Fire. In his view, since Li Daoji was Ding Ning's sect uncle, when he was cultivating in White Goat Cave, Ding Ning naturally knew Li Daoji's method and vital energy well, and could borrow Li Daoji's vital energy. But since he had seen Ding Ning's moves, he would not let this happen again. Tantai Guanjin understood Meng Fangying's meaning and immediately became nervous. Li Daoji was just a cultivator of White Goat Cave. How could a cultivator from such a place stop Meng Fangying? Even when Shui Wangshu defeated Liang Lian back then, Liang Lian's cultivation could not be compared to the current Meng Fangying. However, at this moment, Ding Ning's expression became somewhat strange. He looked straight into Meng Fangying's eyes and said with a strange tone, "Old man Shui felt that he could not teach him and sent him away. Of course, he had to find him a much stronger teacher. Old man Shui is too old. Although he might not necessarily win in a fight, in terms of knowledge and experience, how many people are better than him?" Meng Fangying's brows unconsciously furrowed, an ominous premonition rising in his heart. At the next moment, a sword hum rang out in front of him. He still did not feel that Li Daoji could pose any threat to him, but every word Ding Ning said would affect his confidence. So he did not want to say more. As the sword hum sounded, mountainous primal energies of the universe roared in the sky. However, they did not enter the sword shadow that suddenly appeared in his hand, but flooded into his body. His body suddenly grew tall and gave off a presence that looked down on the world. He slashed at Li Daoji with his sword. There were no finesse. This sword was like an enormous rock, brutal and domineering. It carried all of his energy and vital energy as it smashed towards Li Daoji. The simpler the sword moved, the more it could force the opponent to use the same simple method to deal with it. This turned into a pure collision of power. Meng Fangying had been Realm 7 20 years ago. While he had not broken through the door between Realm 7 and 8, his vital energy had been refined and pure like iron. How could a cultivator who had just entered Realm 7 compare to his vital energy? Tantai Guanjian took a deep breath. He was very nervous. For Meng Fangying, this was a simple probing attack, but it could become a killing blow. At this time, Li Daoji slowly inhaled. He calmed his mind, took half a step back, and then gripped the small, white jade sword at his waist. An enormous boom sounded between Li Daoji and Meng Fangying. The thousands of dust mountains echoed at the same time like there were countless giant swords colliding in these dust mountains. After these sounds, everyone saw a slightly curved sword light was still firmly in front of Li Daoji. Meng Fangying's body, which gave off a domineering presence, was thrown back. Other than the sound of the collision, it was completely silent. Tantai Guanjian's eyes widened. He was shocked but not shocked. He immediately understood this sword move. White Goat Hanging Horn was at a stalemate. Li Daoji held the sect master sword of White Goat Cave, and what he was using now was the secret sword of White Goat Cave that defeated the strong White Goat Hanging Horn. Meng Fangying was shocked. While he was not injured, the vital energy in his body was vibrating violently, and he felt an unprecedented discomfort. His sword strike had instead made him feel as if he had crashed into a city wall while sprinting. The life-bond sword in his hand showed its true appearance. This was a silver-white sword that seemed to be made from the light of the moon, and gave off a quiet but mysterious feeling. As he retreated, he swung the sword in his hand. The vibrating vital energy in his body immediately calmed down as it surged. The life-bond sword in his hand gave off bright light, hot but not blinding. The silver-white brilliance turned into a crescent moon, concealing his figure within. The sword intent filled the space, but it gave off a very mysterious feeling, making it difficult to determine when and where this sword strike would land. This sword was called Moonlight, and was one of the Meng family's 7 Absolutes sword manual. The 7 Absolutes sword manual was the Meng family's ultimate sword manual. It recorded 7 sword moves with different energies, but also unpredictable and powerful. Li Daoji's gaze was stern, but his posture did not change much. His left hand gripped the long sword in front of his chest and created some sword wind. These sword winds had no power, and only made people think of the spring wind blowing willow branches. But in the next moment, the white jade sect master sword in his right hand flicked out again. In the world in front of him, and in the dust mountains, there was another explosion like 1,000 giant swords colliding. The slightly curved sword light flashed in front of him. In front of the sword light, Meng Fangying's figure retreated even further. This time, even Tantai Guanjian could not help but exclaim softly, "Another Ares hanging horn." But this same sword defeated one of Meng Fangying's unpredictable 7 absolute sword. Chapter 669. Meng Fangying found it hard to imagine. He swung his sword again. The life-bond sword in his hand was first bathed in a faint indigo light. Then the sword disappeared in a bright and hot halo, but the sword essence spread through the air. This sword was called Spring and Summer. It was also one of the Meng family's 7 absolute swords. The meaning was the profound and hard-to-grasp change between spring and summer. The path of the sword was even more profound and hard to find. He was certain that more than half of the grandmasters in Chongling could not determine the true path of this sword. This sword seemed to have left his body and completely melted in the warm wind of spring and summer. But Li Daoji still did not change. The long sword in his left hand shook slightly, but the sword in his right was still the white goat hanging horn. It was like a white goat on a cliff, facing any beast with its horn. The 1,000 dust mountains roared again. It was accompanied by Meng Fangying's uncontrollable shout. The profound and hard-to-find sword energy spread and collapsed. Only that horn-like sword light remained in the air. His sword was still blocked by Li Daoji using the same sword move. It seemed that Li Daoji only knew this sword move. But this sword seemed to be able to deal with all of his sword moves. So, it is like this. Yantai Guanjian relaxed. He knew where Li Daoji had gone after leaving Chongling. No matter how strange the sword light was, its final destination was the enemy's side, and fell into the enemy's flesh. In the Great Liang Mountains on the border of the Qin dynasty, there was a grandmaster called Zhu Sanqi. His self-created truth glimpse sword essence could determine where the other's sword was going. But passively responding was not as good as one's own agility. While Yantai Guanjin knew of that grandmaster, he had never thought that person's truth glimpse sword essence could form such a perfect defensive sword move when combined with the white goat hanging horn of White Goat Cave. Laughter sounded in the heavy air. Ding Ning laughed. You should have heard of a swordsman in the Han dynasty called Zhong Panshi. He smiled as he looked at Meng Fangying, who had an ugly expression. He said, his real name is Zhong Xiaolu, but all the swordsmen in the world liked to call him Zhong Panshi because his sword was like a rock that stood unmoving in the waves. His defensive sword could defend against the stormy attacks of many swordsmen without showing any weakness. But in terms of using a weak sword to defend, his defense is not as good as my sect uncle's sword move. Zhong Panshi back then could defend against the attacks of many swordsmen of the same cultivation, but he could not defend against the attacks of a swordsman whose vital energy was far above him. Ding Ning turned to look at the Master of Fire, and then smiled even more happily. From this point of view, my martial uncle is somewhat similar to the Master of Fire. If you want to kill me, I'm afraid you have to use up your vital energy with my martial uncle first. Ding Ning's laughter rang in everyone's ears. No one doubted his words. Meng Fangying knew he spoke the truth. Spring and Summer was the most profound sword move of the Meng family's 7 absolute sword. If this move could not defeat Li Daoji's defensive sword, then it was useless for him to use the other moves of the 7 absolute sword. So he looked up. His gaze passed through the dust and the uncertain light towards the endless sky, as though he wanted to project into the cold, starry sky. At the same time, his body gave off a presence of accepting an outside power. Ding Ning was not unfamiliar with this presence. Since Meng Fangying alone could not defeat Li Daoji, then he had to borrow the power of the mistress of the imperial city. Zhang Sun Qinshua looked at Meng Fangying with disdain. In her view, these cultivators who had a special connection to Zheng Xiu were no different from Zheng Xiu's puppets. Yet to her, and everyone present surprise. When Meng Fangying's aura rapidly spread towards the sky above, there was no lonely and cold star fire falling down. Meng Fangying's body was slightly stiff. Everyone on Ding Ning's side was filled with emotion and joy. This meant that a great change had occurred in Chongling. Zheng Xiu might have been killed by Bailey Sushua. Even if she was not, she could not summon the power of the starfire. What if she could not even protect herself? Then what should he do? This was the question Meng Fangying was pondering. He slowly lowered his head. The silver-white life bond sword once again appeared in his hand like flowing water. He made a decision in a breath. If the mistress of the imperial city was not here, and Yuanwu was still in the plains, this empire could not be changed. He only had to fight for this empire and the strength of this empire. If he could only exhaust Li Daoji's vital energy, then he had no other choice. His fingers tightened on the sword hilt, and his vital energy was about to erupt again. Wait for me. But at this time, an old and venomous voice sounded in his ears. His brows naturally furrowed. At the same time, the life-bond sword disappeared from his hand. His figure that was about to move forward retreated into the dust mountain behind him and disappeared in an instant. He recognized that this voice came from the old monster of Jiaodong Commandery, whose body had been cut in half by Ding Ning. The old monster was obviously dead for sure, but from the voice that entered his ears at this moment, he knew that the old monster was suppressing his injuries and then preparing to activate the last of his strength. This should not take long. A cultivator covered in dust walked through the mountains. He was Su Xiaomu. When he sent out the order of Fenghe province, he saw many sword lights in response. Some were warnings, some were threats, and some pointed the way for him. He was in a hurry. His vital energy and primal energies of the universe flowed out of his body like worthless river water. The primal energies of the universe could not be replenished in time, and his body seemed to become empty, sucking in the dust on the path. He did not sleep or rest, but his eyes were exceptionally bright with a sharp light, completely different from when he was cultivating in the Chongling compound. Or rather, he was completely different from Su Xiaomu back then. He could see the outlines of thousands of dust mountains in the distance. At this time, an army appeared in the wilderness ahead of him. The leader of the group was a general wearing a copper-colored armor. Qiying, one of the 3 grandmasters under Meng Fangying. Go! When this general appeared in his perception and seemed to close the distance, Su Xiaomu gave a shout from the bottom of his heart. The fine dust that had been sucked onto his body and even seeped into it was all forced out of his body. There was a cracking sound. A dust sword dozens of feet long appeared in front of him and broke through the air. Die! When the second word came out, this dust sword was in front of Qiying. A blood-like rainbow lit up in front of Scarlet Eagle. But at the same time, his red armor gave off soft sounds. Blood-soaked, dust flew out from behind him. His eyes widened to their limits, and then his pupils were filled with blood from the small holes. His consciousness disappeared, and he died. Chapter 670. Qiying had many subordinates behind him. In the past few months, the entire army and cultivators of the Qin dynasty had experienced an unprecedented secret migration, including the family generals of the Meng Marquisate establishment. It was difficult to find similar examples in the history of countless dynasties. For most cultivators of the Qin dynasty, this matter meant that they would be recorded in the history books. Many of them were prepared to die on this battlefield before they came. Death sometimes meant leaving behind a heavy mark in the history books. Yet, neither Red Eagle nor the subordinates behind him had thought that a Realm 7 Grandmaster could be killed with one strike from so far away, almost at the limit of perception. He did not even have a chance to fight back. Why is it like this? When this voice sounded in the minds of these subordinates, Qiying's armor, made from refined mountain copper, gave off ear-piercing cracking sounds. Pieces of armor exploded like fragile roof tiles. Qiying's warhorse jumped up in panic, and Qiying's body collapsed backwards like a mountain. Feng Xiaomu's body floated up. Following the wind in his mind, his body was weightless. He faced the army. Qiying's subordinates, who were in great shock, did not know what was happening. It was like a miraculous scene. Fang Xiaomu was clearly very far away from them, but he had already flown over. He was in the sky, right above them. Release! A drop of sweat dripped down from the beard of one of Qi Ying's subordinates. This middle-aged general, with an incomparably pale face, issued an order with a strange voice. Countless seal weapons were activated with shrill howls. Dense rainbows of various colors formed a curtain of light. Carrying a terrifying killing intent, it first enveloped the canopy of the sky above. These seal weapons had no emotions. What followed was the light from the flying swords and other weapons of the cultivators in the army. The three eagles of the Ming Marquisate establishment had fought on the border for many years. The seal weapons that each army carried were enough to kill multiple Realm 7s. But at this moment, no one dared to hope to kill Fang Xiaomu directly, and only wanted to delay this terrifying opponent. Fang Xiaomu's figure high up in the sky seemed to have lost its momentum and couldn't go any higher. However, what was shocking was that when this dense rain of light attacked his body, when it was still far from his body suddenly seemed to be pushed by a great force and instead flung high up into the air. In that instant, he gave everyone the feeling that he was like a carp swimming against the current. He was already about to fall, but he just happened to gain new strength and soared into the sky. A belt of light appeared behind Fang Xiaomu. The primal energies of the universe and the rainbow lights of the seal weapons, and even the flying swords and life-bond items of many cultivators inexplicably changed. Primal energies of the universe left the flying swords and life-bond items, turning into mottled light that gathered towards the belt of light behind Fang Xiaomu. This was an even more stunning scene. Even the subordinate who had been the first to guard his mind and give the order could not control his emotions and started to tremble all over. At this time, Fang Xiaomu was very moved. This was a true feeling of a fish turning into a dragon, the feeling of one's own transformation. The cultivators on the ground below were puzzled, but he finally understood. Many years ago, that person thought to be invincible had come to Fangho province to see him, had a meal with him, and then left him with a sentence. Moving mountains is just moving primal energies of the universe. There is nothing strange about that. He could not understand the meaning of the words at all. At the time, he had been stuck between Realm 6 and 7 and had not even truly experienced moving mountains in Realm 7. Then a decade later, he felt he could cross Realm 6 at any time and truly enter Realm 7. Yet he always felt it was not complete and something was missing. When the news of his beloved brother Fang Xiang's death came, he understood what was missing was a fighting spirit and impulse. Without determination to move forward, how could one break through the rapids? Only when he had a breakthrough in the quarry and came to this battlefield to kill Qi Ying with one blow did he truly understand the true meaning of the words that person had left him back then. The answer could be found in the Deer Mountain Conference. Yuan Wu had fought the strongest grandmasters in the world. He had been exhausted, but borrowing Huang Jinwei's energy, he had turned the situation around. If one's body was cultivated to the point where they could instantly move mountains of energy, it was not strange to be able to move the energies of the universe. So Realm 8 could not just open another world and touch the energies of even more distant worlds. Even more importantly, they could move the energies of many other cultivators in the surrounding perceptual distance, including the energies that naturally flowed from their bodies, that had floated through the world in the previous battle, and even the energies that had gathered in their weapon seal scripts, borrowing the power of the people around them for their own use. So what that person had said to him back then was not the bottleneck between Realm 6 and Realm 7, but a comprehension between Realm 7 and Realm 8. Chapter 671. The cultivator who devoured the primal chi in the sky like a monster and then extended countless invisible tentacle-like auras upwards was the white eagle. Regardless of whether it was red eagle, black eagle, or white eagle, their titles came from the color of their armor and the fact that they were the three strongest cultivators under Meng Fangying's command. The red eagle's armor was made from the best copper in the world. The black eagle's armor was made from the scales of the black flood dragon. and the White Eagle's flawless white armor was made from the skull of the White Eagle. White Kuei was a strange bird that lived on an island deep in the North Sea. They did not know their fate and were not as fierce as beasts. However, their skulls naturally gathered pure primal energies of the universe. A piece about the size of a thumb was as white as jade and tougher than refined gold. Under external resistance, it would naturally release primal energies of the universe. At this time, in the depression opposite Black Eagle, White Eagle's armor was made from an unknown number of these skulls. The snow-white armor was seamlessly formed and even covered his face. This meant that it was unknown just how many Baikue had to be killed to obtain the necessary materials for this set of armor. Right now, this cultivator's vital essence erupted from a sea of energy, moving along the symbols inside the armor, completely activating the different type of vital energy contained within every piece of armor. The countless translucent tentacles had an inexplicable brutal aura. They were like countless vengeful spirits of Baikue that silently filled the entire sky, blocking the natural flow of Yuan Qi. Only an extremely small amount of heaven-earth Yuan Qi was able to flow through the gaps between the vengeful spirits of Baikue. The energy that could flow down quickly gathered towards Black Eagle's body. Fang Shimu passed by Red Eagle's army, and suddenly sensed the abnormality ahead. His perception was not as clear as Black Eagle, who was familiar with White Eagle. In his perception, countless white birds suddenly appeared in the sky ahead of him. The bodies of these white birds continued to expand, layer upon layer, covering the entire sky. The primal energies of the universe that could flow down through the cracks between these white birds were guided by another cultivator. The primal energies of the universe that were flowing towards him were cut off by these white birds. Therefore, this was a joint effort of two cultivators. Two cultivators with completely different cultivation methods had miraculously weaved a law domain that prevented the other cultivators from gathering Yuan Qi and only allowed one person to use it. This kind of cooperation was not just a simple layering of power. It was far more difficult to deal with than the sword energies of multiple Realm 7s attacking at the same time. Fang Shimu paused slightly. He needed some time to think about how to deal with these two cultivators. The Black Eagle raised its head high, accepting the nourishment of the mountain of vital energy. He raised his eyebrows slightly in pain. The sound of flesh tearing came from his body. The vital energy, surging out of his energy, combined with the primal energies of the universe to form an indescribable power, and then disintegrated into the armor on his body. Pieces of scales separated from his body and flew out, emitting a strong aura of a natal item. In the world of cultivators, the aura of the life bond item meant that it was unique to him. It was incompatible with other people's primordial qi, and even made people feel that it carried the smell of his flesh and blood. At this moment, the scales that flew out from his body were like this. The outer surface was a glossy black, but the inner surface was scarlet, like the color of fresh flesh. Pieces of scales that flew out from his body cut through the air, producing a hissing sound and cutting out streams of wind visible to the naked eye. These scales seemed to fly chaotically, but they had their own positions in the air. In a flash, they formed an enormous whip, and this whip was in the shape of a serpent. Even the generals behind him were shocked. They had never seen such an astounding sight before. There were cracks in the black scales, but they were filled with bright red light. It was like a black serpent had come alive and merged with the Black Eagle's power. Previously, no one had known that the Black Eagle's life bond item was the armor on his body. When the serpent dragon took form, it did not pause and bit at Fang Shimu in the air. Fang Shimu's body was falling naturally. He was not a true realm 8, and could not be like the Yunwu Emperor, who could break through the small world these Realm 7 cultivators created with their own energy and draw down the holy primal energies of outer space. However, at this moment, he already understood that even if he only touched a corner of level 8, it was still the power of level 8. As long as he could unleash this to the extreme. In this moment on the ground below, almost all the cultivators in the three armies exclaimed in incomprehension. Feng Xiaomu's vital energy floated out like a dissipation. Even some of the lowest level cultivators could feel the vital energy brushing past them like a breeze. This vital energy from Feng Xiaomu naturally aroused their enmity. In the next moment, they inexplicably found their surroundings quiet and seemed to become emptier. In front of the black serpent whip in the sky, an inexplicable light suddenly appeared with a kind of divine presence. For cultivators, divinity meant a realm they could not touch, and a power that surpassed understanding. An enormous sword of light formed around Feng Xiaomu and passed towards the black serpent. The clear sound of armor breaking sounded in the sky. It was like the wail and unwilling howl of a serpent before its death. Blood-red flames and shattered scales shot out in all directions, and even collided with the countless resentful spirits of Bai Kuei that covered the sky. Countless violent crashing sounds resounded in the sky as countless balls of flame exploded in the sky. Black Eagle and White Eagle seemed to be struck by lightning at the same time. Their bodies were slammed to the ground by a great force and then bounced up. Many fine beads of blood sprayed out of their skin, and the two of them still vomited blood. Black Eagle, whose life bond item had been destroyed, was so shocked his mind was blank. He felt his vitality flowing away, but he could not think. White Eagle, who was less injured, widened his eyes and was shrouded in a kind of powerlessness and terror. This was the first time the two of them had worked together. In his imagination, they could kill any Realm 7 in the world, but Feng Xiaomu had defeated them with one blow. What he could not imagine was that much of the vital energy that had escaped from Feng Xiaomu's body seemed to know the way home and flowed back into his meridians and meridians. This did not make sense in the world of cultivators. To put it simply, how could the strength of a punch be retracted back into the fist? Feng Xiaomu did not care about the feelings of these two cultivators. He needed to get close to the thousand-layer dust mountain as quickly as possible, so he could not give anyone who was a threat to him a chance to attack. In this moment, he flicked his hand and sent out another sword energy. Pew! There was an explosion in White Eagle's energy sea. A sharp sword energy was not able to penetrate his white armor, but hit his energy sea like a hammer and caused the Jade Palace deep in his energy sea to almost collapse. Chapter 672. Vying spat out another mouthful of blood. The blood contained many transparent crystals like gemstones. These were his purest vital energy crystals, but some of them naturally separated from the blood and followed the flow of primal energies of the universe to land on Feng Xiaomu's body and then disappear. Most people could not see this scene clearly, but the three armies and some other cultivators in the vast plain sensed it. These people were shocked. Adding on Su Xiaomu's performance in the previous battle, this method of swallowing other people's vital energy was no different from the monsters of the legends. But Feng Xiaomu's presence was natural and clean, and his sword light even had a kind of holy presence. Therefore, these people, including the White Eagle, had a completely new understanding. They thought of some things that were not recorded in the ancient books. These experiences and comprehensions could not be directly turned into anything, but they were like seeds that landed in the hearts of these cultivators. In the vast plains between the three armies of the Ming Marquisate establishment and the Dust Mountains, there were naturally other grandmasters. But even the three eagles working together could not stop Feng Xiaomu, and did not even seem to injure Feng Xiaomu at all. This caused people to sigh with emotion and shock, even despair. Ever since the Battle of Chongling before Yuan Wu's ascension, the world of cultivators had been relatively calm. But after the Deer Mountain Conference, astounding flashes appeared in the world of cultivators. The Donghu monk charging into the imperial palace, and today, Su Xiaomu defeating the three eagles as though he was unstoppable. The cultivators of the world once again realized that even among Realm 7 grandmasters, there was an enormous gap. Now, these despairing cultivators in the plains knew that they could not change anything even if they attacked, and could not stop Feng Xiaomu's advance. But seeing these battles with their own eyes, these seeds in their hearts would cause great changes to the future world of cultivators. No one stopped him. The dust mountains were in front of him. Sensing the sword essence in the dust mountains, Feng Xiaomu's eyes showed great respect. Then he unhesitatingly threw himself into them. Some uncontrollable cheers sounded in the plains. These people were the friends of the Bazinkindo ground, or the enemies of Yuan Wu and Zheng Xiao. But they were either stopped by their opponents or had no power to approach the dust mountains. In their view, Feng Xiaomu's arrival could decide the final outcome of this battle. When Feng Xiaomu entered the dust mountain formation, his presence naturally attracted the energy in the dust mountains, causing them to move in a strange rhythm. Feng Xiaomu is here. Ding Ning immediately sensed this wondrous rhythm and said emotionally to Zhang Sun Qinxue, Yantai Guanjian, and the others. At the same time, the enemies in the spirit design also learned of Feng Xiaomu's arrival. What greeted Feng Xiaomu was a mysterious and violent sword chi. This sword chi was like an enraged giant, hysterically shaking the world and tearing the sky apart. Before Feng Xiaomu could even see what was happening, a corner of the dust mountain had already been cut open. This mysterious and violent sword chi had already sealed off all his paths of advance and retreat like an earth-shattering sandstorm, engulfing everything within. Anger itself was a terrifying power. It was the soul of this sword chi. However, Feng Xiaomu was not nervous at all when he encountered such a terrifying sword chi as soon as he entered the formation. His breakthrough was due to anger. A cultivator like a stone Buddha would either not be angry, or if he was angry, his anger would rarely be matched by others. So Feng Xiaomu naturally returned a blow. His sword had fully unleashed the fury of losing his most respected and beloved elder brother. As he swung his sword, the air even burned with golden flames. With an enormous boom, the sword chi in front of him could not be matched and was torn apart like cloth by a sharp weapon. With a disbelieving shout, the cultivator who had released this blow appeared at the bottom of the pit not far in front of Feng Xiaomu. That enormous pit came from the collision of this blow. This cultivator was Meng Fangying. His lips were covered in blood. While he still stood at the bottom of the pit like he was made of metal, there was the sound of waves crashing inside his body. Meng Fangying, who had suffered heavy blows, seemed to have reached his limit. Yet he did not stop and gave another shout. With this shout, the sword in front of him shone brightly. He felt like he was breaking out of a cocoon and being reborn. The power of this sword was even stronger than the previous blow. This blow was the first of the 7 swords of the Ming Marquisate establishment, Cocoon Break. This sword essence did not just break through the limits of many of his meridians. It could produce even more power after being wounded. Even more importantly, the sword energy had the ability to break through some of the laws of energy flow and obstruct the power of the enemy's energy gathering. As he shouted and the sword energy formed, a wretched body appeared in the dust mountain to Feng Xiaomu's left. This was the old monster from Jiaodong Commandery, whose body had been cut in half by Ding Ning. When the remaining vital essence in her body gushed out like a storm, she could no longer suppress the injuries on her body. Endless blood and even some broken organs splashed out of her body. The last bit of power that shot out from her body pulled at the primordial chi in the formation and finally turned into a crimson-red ray of light. This light was filled with a sense of decay, like the decay of time. Feng Xiaomu took a deep breath. He attacked with his sword. Thunder roared in the dust mountain. The thunder did not spread outwards, but gathered towards his body. A sword light with holy light lit up in front of him, and then split into 2. A muffled explosion. The body of the old monster from Jiaodong Commandery was shattered into pieces, like bright flower petals flying in the dust. Feng Xiaomu fell into a pit hundreds of feet away. There were countless blood lines on his body. The crimson-red light came out of his skin and gave his body a sense of decay. Meng Fangying sat at the bottom of the pit. He looked at Feng Xiaomu, who was heavily injured. Other than shock, he felt this was absurd. In this moment, he could not understand why Fang Shimu dared to take his and Zheng An's combined attack head-on. Then he started to vomit blood, large mouthfuls of blood. A tiny sword energy that he could not control had attacked his heart meridian and cut off one of his main meridians. He could not control the blood gushing out of his body. He could only vomit blood uncontrollably, like he wanted to vomit all the blood in his body. The hot blood was bitter in his mouth. Now he understood. Facing just now's assassination, Fang Shimu had completed the assassination. Chapter 673. Meng Fangying could not accept this. He persisted in standing up from the bottom of the hole, his body uncontrollably swaying like an infant who had just learned how to walk. He vomited blood and spat out the bitterness in his mouth. He walked towards Fang Shimu until he reached the hole Fang Shimu was in. Do you know how long it took to set up this trap? How much did the Qin dynasty pay for the 9-death silkworm to appear and be trapped here? How many lives were paid for this spring war against the Chu? He had almost spat out all the blood in his body. Meng Fangying's face was paler than paper. He understood that he had reached the last moment of his life. His expression was complicated. Such a murderous situation, but it ended in such a way. Do you think I can accept this? Fang Shimu looked up at him and did not answer. His breathing was difficult. Some blood surged into his lungs, and there seemed to be no need to answer such a question. This is a method of exchanging pieces in a chess game. Meng Fangying could not hold on any longer. His body collapsed like a mountain, and he sat down at the edge of the hole. But his voice turned harsher. But you just had a breakthrough, and could easily enter this dust mountain formation. This means that you are Realm 7, but close to Realm 8. You wanted to defeat my 3 eagles, and come here unstoppably. You must be proud, but why did you use such a method of exchanging pieces? Should you not try to defeat us without putting yourself in a hopeless situation? Once a breakthrough, all things in the world are ants. Your state of mind after defeating grandmasters, you should feel that you can easily defeat us. If you do this, in my plan, Zheng En and I will waste your power. In the end, you will die, and I will live. Why did you do this? As the shouts grew louder, Fang Shimu grew more and more frustrated, but he could not help but sympathize with this marquis of the Qin dynasty. He finally looked at Meng Fangying and said, "At this time, I have not been able to kill the 9-death silkworm. Once I entered here, I encountered assassinations like you. Even an old ancestor like Jiaodong Commandery has put his last power on me. In my view, this should be the final battle. If I can kill you, I can resolve this situation. Then why bother about the process? But what about your cultivation?" Meng Fangying used the last of his strength to roar. "Your meridians are broken. Even if you don't become a cripple like your brother Fang Xiang, you will probably only be able to heal after decades of hard work. How can you enter Realm 8? Hearing this roar, Fang Shimu's expression became somewhat strange. He slowly closed his eyes and said softly and seriously, "There is something you probably didn't understand from the start. I am here for my brother. I came here because of anger and revenge. My brother and father have fought for the Qin dynasty for many years. Many of our brothers have died in battle, but in the end, they became sacrifices to complete such a trap. Just for Zheng Xiao and Yuan Wu's ambitions? As for vengeance and things like advancing to the 8th tier, there are people in this array who are better at it than me." Fang Shimu still had his eyes closed and smiled bleakly. If he enters Realm 8, Zheng Xiao and Yuan Wu cannot defeat him. If this kind of exchange can decide the final outcome, why not do it? No one responded. He heard the sound of Meng Fangying's body rolling down. Meng Fangying died and rolled to the bottom of the pit not far in front of him. Then Fang Shimu heard the piercing sound of flapping wings. He opened his eyes. The flickering light was still dazzling. He first saw a unique little mixed gold silkworm, and then saw many people. Among these people, he saw Ding Ning. Looking at Ding Ning's calm gaze, he nodded in greeting and said deeply, "Previously, I saw you in Chongling and thought you were trash who could not cultivate. But today, seeing you, I know it is you. But you are not the same as before. Ding Ning understood his meaning and nodded in greeting. He said softly, "Living after dying once, no one could be the same as before." In the 1,000 dust mountains, all sound gradually disappeared and became completely silent. The chaotic energy calmed down. The sword essence that formed the 1,000 dust mountains loosened slightly because of Feng Shimu's arrival and started to slowly dissolve. The streams of dust turned into wondrous flowing flames that flew up and disappeared in the wind. They had survived, but from Ding Ning's words, no one could hear much excitement and joy, only indescribable emotion and sadness. Those who could and dared to enter the 1,000 dust mountains had entered long ago. Those who had not entered now would have a hard time finding another chance. But in this wilderness, there would always be people who were not willing to give up and were still trying. Following a dark and cold wind, more than half of the water in a small lake not far from the 1,000 dust mountain formations suddenly disappeared and was swept up by a white shadow. This was an enormous white serpent, carrying a strange saddle on its back. The saddle was connected to a small Taoist temple. The saddle and the temple were the size of 2 carriages and made from a unique half-transparent white crystal. For some unknown reason, it could allow the cultivators inside to survive underwater for a long time. There was a Taoist in the crystal temple. His sleeves were empty, his hands cut off long ago. But this white serpent's presence was comparable to a Realm 7 Grandmaster. This Taoist was naturally a rare expert. Some of the cultivators who were close to the lake saw this scene, but they were not too shocked. When they confirmed that the cultivator trapped in the Dust Mountain Formation was the heir to the 9-Death Silkworm, or the rebirth of the 9-Death Silkworm as Yuan Wu said, it would be normal for any kind of Grandmaster to appear on the plains. In the last dozen days, many Realm 7 Grandmasters had died on the plains. People were numb, and even wondered how there could be so many Realm 7s in the world. Just like in Chongling back then, the corpses of Grandmasters from all the dynasties had piled into a small mountain. This Grandmaster was not old, but he had an ancient presence. He had hidden in the lake for a long time, but did not enter the formation. Clearly, he did not want to save the 9-Death Silkworm inside. At this time, he decided to enter the formation to take a look, but he had not expected that someone had been guarding him for a long time. An emotionless killing intent suddenly appeared behind him, and he did not even sense it when it came close to his crystal temple. It was only when this killing intent pierced through his crystal palace that he sensed it, and through this killing intent, he knew who had attacked him. Bai Qi. When this killing intent pierced his body, he shouted in shock and disbelief. He had not expected such a person to quietly guard him for many days and not stand on his and Zheng Xiu's side. Chapter 674. The 1,000 dust mountains started to dissipate. The sword essences that had been in the world for many years started to dissipate. Wisps of pure vital qi that originally belonged to the past experts began to disperse, bringing with them plumes of dust. They blossomed into colorful fireworks in the sky, as if thousands of heavenly trees were blooming. Yi Zhao's last consciousness that he had forcefully kept started to dissipate. He looked dazedly at the sword formation that was starting to collapse. In his blurry vision, the figure of the old woman from Jiaodong Commandery did not appear. He felt great disappointment and vaguely felt that the matter had not developed as he had hoped. In this moment of disappointment, he could not hold on any longer. The last breath left in his chest surged out of his body. This old nobleman who walked in the night fell into eternal darkness. On the distant hill, Yuan Wu looked calmly at the 1,000 dust mountains that were starting to dissipate. The beautiful scene of fireworks burning and then disappearing represented the end of an expert like Yi Xiao who could affect the situation in Chongling. There had been many ends like this over the years, but he still existed. The cultivator holding the yellow paper umbrella was still standing behind him. At this time, he said softly to Yuan Wu, "That person has left." Yuan Wu did not have a great reaction, just a soft sound of acknowledgement. The cultivator holding the yellow paper umbrella continued, "It is Zhao Si of the Zhao Sword Furnace. In the end, she could not resist and sent out a thread of sword essence to test me, but I ignored her. She is also a hero. Yuanwu nodded and said. His conversation with the cultivator holding the yellow paper umbrella was very calm. But if someone heard it now, they would be greatly shocked. So Zhao Si was already here. The only reason Zhao Si did not go to the Thousand Dust Mountains was to take the chance to assassinate Yuanwu, or to keep an eye on this cultivator next to Yuanwu and not let him enter the Dust Mountains. Yet, Zhao Si had watched for a long time, but was still wary of this cultivator holding the yellow paper umbrella and did not act. Hearing the words of this cultivator holding the yellow paper umbrella, even in the end, Zhao Si was not able to gain an advantage. What kind of existence was able to intimidate Zhao Si from above? Exchanged a lot of gold. The person holding the yellow paper umbrella said coolly. Yuanwu nodded and said slowly, when all these people die, the world will be at peace. Actually, I don't even know what a mission is. The Qin people call me a great rebel. Actually, I don't like to kill the Qin people. But I know very well that even if I want to live here quietly, the Qin people will not let me go. A large river surrounded the capital of Chu. On both sides of the river were fertile fields that were verdant and lush. At this moment, the Qin and Chu borders were filled with fighting, but in the Chu capital, it was a peaceful scene. On the side of the river, there was a medical center on the side of a cliff. The medical center was famous. In the past, many people came and went. There were inns and taverns on the riverside below, and there was even a pier. However, today, this place was used by the emperor. Other than the doctors, this medical hall only accepted 2 guests, one of whom was a patient. A woman in white robes stood by the window and looked at the scenery. She looked at the fertile land on the 2 sides of the river and said to the patient on the bed, "But you lived and died for the Chu. If you were given another chance, would you still sink to the bottom of the water?" This woman was tall. She did not have a large frame, but she gave people a feeling of great height and arrogance. When she spoke, the surface of the river sparkled, and the waves seemed to gather towards her in an ingratiating manner. In the world, only 2 women who cultivated special methods could naturally possess the presence of the Emperor of Water. One was Yi Siling, and the other was Bai Shanshui. Yi Siling was small in stature, and Bai Shanshui was tall. She often dressed as a man. This woman by the window was naturally Bai Shanshui. The patient on the bed was Li Yunrui. The torture in the great floating water prison had been too severe. Even now, Li Yunrui had not completely recovered. He needed to rely on the best doctor of the Chu capital to slowly recuperate. He and Bai Shanshui had retreated from Chongling to here. They had accompanied each other day and night, and were familiar with each other. Even the affection between their brows was not much different from that of ordinary lovers. Hearing Bai Shanshui's seemingly solemn question, Li Yunrui smiled slightly and said, "If I had another chance, of course I would not sink to the bottom of the water." Bai Shanshui turned and smiled with rare charm. "Why?" Li Yunrui pretended to sigh. "In the past, I had no attachments. But now it is different. When I have attachments, I feel terror." After a pause, he looked at Bai Shanshui and said, "To put it simply, I cannot bear to do it." Bai Shanshui shook her head and said, "You have a glib tongue." Li Yunrui smiled and said, "This is due to having a beauty by my side. In the past, I was not like this." Bai Shanshui smiled and turned to walk to the side of the path. She picked up a bowl of almost warm medicinal soup, took a jade spoon, and handed it to Li Yunrui. Li Yunrui reached out. But at this moment, Bai Shanshui frowned and suddenly turned around. "What is it?" Li Yunrui looked at the bowl of medicinal soup and saw the edges of the bowl start to tremble. He immediately felt that something was wrong and became nervous. Bai Shanshui was silent. She gazed at the distant river surface. There was nothing on this vast river surface, but she sensed many unusual flows of water moving in the depths. These flows of water contained unusual energy and gradually formed many enormous shadows in her perception. This huge shadow filled her heart with an ominous premonition, as if many giant beasts were sneaking into her heart. "Be careful," Li Yunrui heard Bai Shanshui's words. In the next moment, the bowl was in his hand, and Bai Shanshui was on the river's surface. There was a cracking sound. There was a loud hiss in the air. A white sword light charged into the sky. Bai Shanshui stood on the water's surface as though she was standing on flat ground. However, her expression was grave and gloomy to the extreme. In the next moment, the water under her feet started to sway violently. The water of the entire river started to sway like water in a basin. There were many loud crashing sounds coming from the bottom of the river in the distance. It was like a chaotic flow of water hitting an enormous bell at the bottom of the river. The unique metallic sounds accompanied the sound of water and caused enormous waves to rise on the river surface. Li Yunrui could not take his medicine with peace of mind. He stood by the window. In the next moment, his breathing completely stopped. On the river's surface where the sound came from, waves dozens of meters high rose. The mud and pieces of fish and shrimp at the bottom of the river sprayed out. Then there were mountainous shadows of steel ships. These steel ships flashed with cold light and caused Li Yunrui's eyes to feel pain. Chapter 675. Pain in the eyes and pain in the heart. This was a very direct feeling. This intense pain was so heavy that Li Yunrui could not breathe. He and Bai Shanshui were not ordinary people. He had been the most trusted death warrior of the Chu king, and Bai Shanshui had spent her entire life fighting against the Qin dynasty and many experts. So he and Bai Shanshui likely knew more about the Qin dynasty than ordinary officials of the Qin dynasty. There were immortal mountains overseas, and the mountains had immortal medicines. For many years, the strength of Jiaodong Commandery came from the rich production overseas. The many spirit medicines of the Qin dynasty, and some of the medicines that allowed the cultivators of the Qin dynasty to progress quickly, were closely related to overseas trade. When the reform of the Qin dynasty started, the Qin dynasty used the armored fleets to conquer the seas around Jiaodong Commandery and many island countries. From then on, the Qin dynasty's fleets could sail to waters unknown to the other dynasties and not return for months. The armored ships of the Qin dynasty were unique to the Qin dynasty. Supposedly, the blueprints came from the Yu dynasty, and the blueprints were carved on the 8 golden figures. This kind of enormous ship was called nether floats in the Yu dynasty. In the records and rumors, after Yuanwu ascended the throne, he increased his exploration of the unknown seas in hopes of obtaining more spirit medicines. Before the Deer Mountain Conference, this kind of exploration was thought to be based on the desire to reach Realm 8. But after the Deer Mountain Conference, everyone in the world knew that Yuanwu had officially reached Realm 8. Then they all thought that Yuanwu was still willing to expend the power of the country to send larger fleets to explore the seas because he wanted to have a longer lifespan. A strong body, abundant energy, and a long lifespan were important to a cultivator. When a cultivator grew older and their energies weakened, even if they had more cultivation experience, their energies and vital energy would decline, and they would not be able to reach a higher cultivation level. After Realm 8 was the legendary Realm 9. When one had an unprecedentedly strong dynasty, they would have a longer reign. So everyone thought that Yuanwu was pursuing the path of longevity. The commander of the Qin dynasty's nether float fleet was Su Fu. He was a study attendant and cultivator who had grown up with Yuanwu. He had been one of Yuanwu's most trusted aides. He commanded almost all of the nether floats of the Qin dynasty to the unknown seas, opening up new territories and searching for immortal medicines for the Qin dynasty. But now, with the impact of the river water, the ferocious armored fleet was forced to reveal itself from the water. If it wasn't this nether float fleet, then what was it? Why are you here? Bai Shanshui was used to seeing many big scenes. Even when she had been discovered in the streets of Chongling and charged out of the city, she had not felt much fear. But now, her hands were cold and stiff. She understood what this huge fleet meant to Li Yunrui, who was behind her, and what it meant to the nearby capital city. However, she could not understand many things. No matter what record it was, the fact that such a heavy armored ship could travel at such a high speed was a miracle and a mystery in itself. Moreover, there had never been any record of a netherfloat ship being able to travel underwater. If they could, then Yi Sealing would have told her long ago. She had lived with Yi Sealing for a long time in Chongling. Other than learning from each other's cultivation methods, they had naturally exchanged many secrets about the Qin dynasty. Yi Sealing had been in close contact with these fleets overseas. She could not know the structure of these armored ships. So these nether floats must have been secretly modified into monsters that could travel underwater after going out to sea this time. But even so, this fleet was too large. When hundreds of such giant warships passed under the water, it was inevitable that they would produce unique yuan qi fluctuations. These energy vibrations could not escape her perception, and naturally could not escape the perception of some cultivators who cultivated special methods. From the outer seas, through the harbor, and through this river to here, they had to pass through large areas of the Qi and Yin dynasties. There were numerous experts in the Darqi dynasty and Daryan dynasty, so how could they possibly conceal their presence and appear silently without anyone noticing? Li Yunrui's heart ached so much he could not breathe. Most of the Chu dynasty's armies and experts were on the battlefields of Yin Mountain and Yangshan Commandery. Even the true mistress was fighting on the battlefield. The sudden arrival of the power of such a fleet meant the end of the world. After a few breaths of time, he finally took a deep breath and drank the medicinal concoction in the bowl in one gulp. He put down the bowl, jumped out of the window, and walked on the river to Bai Shanshui's side. The mountainous metal ships jumped out of the water like enormous sea beasts and then smashed into the water. As they created enormous waves, they floated steadily on the water. All of these enormous ships were deep in the water and carried heavy loads. He narrowed his eyes, and through the mist, he saw some of the runes that looked like giant skeletons and demon gods engraved on the giant ships. He also saw the grayish-black Yin energy that lingered in these runes and even enveloped the entire ship. He took a deep breath again and said bitterly, "The Qi Emperor betrayed us." Bai Shanshui also took a deep breath. The gentleness on her face had completely disappeared and turned to cold light. She did not respond and gripped Li Yunrui's hand. Even if she did not understand, she had to see the truth. These enormous ships clearly relied on the ghostly methods of the Qi dynasty to have the ability to move stealthily. These enormous ships were called going out to sea. They most likely had secretly stopped at a harbor where many of the strongest cultivators and craftsmen of the Qi dynasty had workshops. Only if the Qi Emperor was originally on Zheng Xiu's side would these enormous ships silently pass through the Qi dynasty. As to the Yin dynasty, the Qi dynasty had done all they could to quell the rebellion in the past. Just from this, the Qi Emperor naturally had the Yin Emperor's trust. The Yin Emperor may not have known, and allowed an enormous army belonging to the Qin dynasty to silently pass through and approach the Chu capital. The capital of Chu had become the sacrificial lamb of a conspiracy. Regardless of the final outcome of the Yin Mountain and Yangshan Commandery War, when this enormous Qin dynasty army appeared here, the Chu dynasty's end was decided. So now, she was not worried about the result, but what Li Yunrui wanted to do. "What will happen to you?" She gripped Li Yunrui's hand tightly and asked. Li Yunrui was silent for a moment. He looked at her and said, "I hope you will leave. I hope that when all the wars in the world end, you can live peacefully and happily." Chapter 676. I know you were born here and grew up here, but this is meaningless. Bai Shanshui's face inexplicably paled. She shook her head. "Even if we can stop them for a while, the Chu capital will not be able to stop an effective resistance." Bai Shanshui paused for a moment and said in a heavier tone, "I'm more experienced than you in this kind of situation. The nobles in the capital city aren't prepared for battle at all. Although they are experiencing war, they never thought that the place they live in would be occupied one day. You cannot imagine how lowly and cowardly they will behave when they see the army surge in. Those who are going to die are soldiers and some cultivators, but these nobles only want to beg for mercy and still have some good lives." Hearing these sincere words and seeing Bai Shanshui's pale face from thinking back to the past, Li Yunrui tried to breathe and said, "The country is about to be destroyed, and there will be no Chu in the future. I want to do my last bit." Bai Shanshui shook her head with unspeakable stubbornness. "You still have me." Li Yunrui stilled. "Even if the country is gone, with me, there is a home. So even if I die, I cannot die meaninglessly like today." Bai Shanshui looked at Li Yunrui and said. Warmth appeared in Li Yunrui's cold body. He wanted to smile but could not. "You are right." Bai Shanshui's expression turned colder. She looked at the nether floats that had completely revealed themselves and filled up the river. She said, "What I said is right." Li Yunrui did not hesitate and nodded. He said, "Then we will return to the Chu capital and take some people to fight our way out." "Take me back to the Chu capital, and then take me and some people to fight our way out." Bai Shanshui looked at him and said as though correcting him. Li Yunrui was stunned and could not understand. "Boats travel on water. If they want to enter the Chu capital, we cannot let them enter so easily," Bai Shanshui said. "Leave after one attack." Li Yunrui understood and said solemnly. Bai Shanshui nodded. Then she looked up. A transparent water droplet fell from the sky. When this transparent and pure water droplet formed out of thin air and fell, the river surface under her feet rippled. The faint green river water in the sunlight suddenly darkened. Then, many straight white lines appeared in these ripples. Almost all of the true essence in her body gushed out, falling into these straight white lines and merging into the river water. A loud thud was heard. The transparent water droplet fell into the river. Countless raindrops suddenly appeared in the clear sky. The primal chi of heaven and earth was attracted by these raindrops and turned into a violent power. The entire surface of the river seemed to be solid. It was cut into countless pieces and then tossed into the air one by one, as if it was piling up into something new. Shi and Yi Sealing were the grandmasters with the greatest mastery of water manipulation in the world. When they used their full strength, the scene was like a miracle. Even Li Yunrui felt suffocated. She felt as if the entire world was shaking. The giant ironclad warships that had just stabilized on the river surface were suddenly lifted up by countless giant pillars and jumped out of the water. These giant ships each weighed tens of thousands of kilograms, and if they were to crash into one another, the damage they would suffer would be extremely shocking. It was only at this moment. Countless roars could be heard from every ship. Countless transparent sword chi surged out from the ship, forming a magnificent sword river. At the same time, numerous portals suddenly opened up on these seemingly seamless giant warships, each of which was releasing an astonishing amount of grayish-black Yin energy. The Yin energy continued to rise like a mountain. Each nether float turned into a mountain in their perception. The sword formation and Yin deity and ghost formation forcibly suppressed the force of the collision, pushing the river down. Bai Shanshui's proud eyes were filled with disbelief. This sword energy formation came from the materials and seal scripts of the nether floats. Countless craftsmen had been needed to set it up, and an astounding number of swordsmen had poured in vital energy for a long time. What shocked and angered her even more was that these Yin and ghost energies were filled with Realm 7 presences. This meant that her and Li Yunrui's deductions were correct. The Qi dynasty had bitten the Chu in the back. Many of the Qi dynasty's Realm 7 grandmasters might be in these giant ships right now. She uncontrollably gave a muffled grunt. Her body was moved by a great force and bounced into the air. It was also at this moment that all the Yin and ghostly energies that surged out from the nether floats suddenly condensed into 13 strands. Howls sounded in the air. These 13 waves of black and gray Yin energy formed 13 tornadoes that crossed the sky and smashed towards her. Li Yunrui's pupils contracted violently. With a shout, his energy surged out of his body and wrapped around Bai Shanshui. In a moment, he retreated many feet, but he still could not completely escape the cover of the 13 tornadoes. There was a loud boom. The 13 black tornadoes hit him and Bai Shanshui. Like 13 black dragons, they smashed him and Bai Shanshui into the water and created waves. When the sky changed, the primal energies of the universe vibrated, and the storm came. The cultivators in the Chu capital saw the Qin dynasty fleet on the river. Just as Bai Shanshui had predicted, the entire city was in chaos. Many cries sounded. Most of the cries did not come from the courtyards of the commoners, but from the courtyards of the nobles. Many of them were important people who looked high and mighty and would never cry in front of the common people. The imperial palace was also in chaos. Many officials and concubines were in a mess like brainless flies. I've already warned you. Now, you should understand why I warned you. In the majestic throne room, the official who had previously represented Jing Xiu to warn Li Lingjun looked at Li Lingjun on the dragon throne and said sincerely, "Now, it is time for you to make the right choice." Li Lingjun's body twisted uneasily on the dragon throne. He suddenly started to cry. He didn't think that he would actually cry like a coward. This was a feeling of everything, of all his past efforts, being shattered. As long as you are willing, you are still the Chu monarch. The expression of the official standing in front of him didn't change at all. He just continued speaking sincerely. "I have brought the Empress' decree. As long as you give the order to submit to a vassal state, do not send the Chu people here to their deaths. You are still the Chu monarch. Or die, and your corpses will be hung on the city gates." Chapter 677. The water roared as the huge steel fleet filled the river and advanced towards the Chu capital. The water on the river was pressed by the energy of the steel ships and gave off sounds like glass shattering. This was like the arrival of a new world and era, an indescribable pressure. There were many military ships and merchant ships of the Darchu dynasty at the docks and ports along the river. But just the impact of the water flow was enough to squeeze these ships together. When they collided, many ships even deformed and exploded. On the city walls along the river, many cultivators and soldiers had bitter expressions. They still stood on the city walls like they were made of metal, not retreating a step. But even a grandmaster like Bai Shanshui could not stop this fleet at all. He had been pushed to the bottom of the river, his fate unknown. How could they stop them? Being able to stand here was already their final glory. Many of the nobles and merchants in the city were thinking of fleeing or surrendering. The messy caravans even crashed together and blocked the usually spacious roads. Some of the mad scholars were chanting some famous verses that had been passed down since ancient times, throwing themselves into the river. Only the approaching nether floats maintained absolute coldness. Under the cover of the sword energies, the decks of these giant ships were empty. No one knew what would come out of these Qin dynasty ships when the cabin doors opened. The Chu imperial palace that used to be filled with music was now deathly silent. Even the sounds of chaos and crying had completely disappeared. It was like it had become a deathly grave. Zhao Mu entered the depths of the imperial palace. His feet stepped over the exquisite jade bricks and entered the most beautiful and majestic throne room. This palace was one of the greatest buildings in human history. It looked slender, but every detail, even the carvings on each beam, would take decades of hard work from a top craftsman. To build a palace like this, it would take almost 100 years of work. But to build a dynasty that could have such a building? It looked very slender on the outside, but it was extremely spacious on the inside, even when the ministers gathered for court meetings. This was the skill of a craftsman. At this time, there was only Li Lingjun on the dragon throne in the hall. So it appeared even more spacious, so spacious it was like a leaf floating in the ocean. It was so spacious it made people flustered and uncomfortable. Zhao Mu stopped 100 steps away from Li Lingjun and knelt down, following the etiquette of a monarch meeting his subject. Then he stood up and looked at the young monarch on the dragon throne, waiting for him to speak. The tears and mucus on Li Lingjun's face had been wiped clean, but his face was exceptionally pale, as if he had applied a layer of white flour. His figure continuously trembled on the dragon throne, his snow-white skin swaying in the gloomy light. After several breaths of time, a begging voice echoed in this palace, "Surrender. Zhao Mu had two very good-looking thin eyebrows, but when he heard this, his eyebrows were as sharp as a blade. We can't. Li Lingjuan's words were simple. His response was also simple, just 3 words. Li Lingjuan's body stiffened. He didn't seem to have expected that this general, who appeared to be very humble in front of him, would reject him so decisively and calmly. This calmness made him think of a youth he had encountered in the streets of Chongling. Many small voices rang out in the deathly silent hall. This sound was like many rats moving and tearing at clothing. Zhao Mu raised his head. He looked straight at Li Lingjun, his gaze no longer like he was looking at an emperor. "I am very disappointed in you," he said slowly and heavily. "The capital can be lost, but the soul cannot die. In the past, no matter how childish you were and how many problems you had, you were the emperor of the Chu and represented the Chu. Even if we cannot flee far and die in battle, the Chu still has a lot of land and many armies outside. But if you use the imperial order to surrender, you will betray all of the Chu and abandon the border armies outside who are fighting to the death for the Chu. They will be attacked from the front and the back. Can they not surrender?" Li Lingjuan's voice trembled even more. "Do not be so childish." Zhao Mu shook his head and said, "The Qin will not allow the millions of Chu soldiers to remain. Think of what happened to the hundreds of thousands of soldiers of the Zhao dynasty after they surrendered." Li Lingjun could not speak. Everything that has happened in the Chu capital today will be recorded in the history books of the future. So I urge you to think carefully one last time, and think of what you will be recorded in the history books of the future. Zhao Mu took a deep breath and said seriously and slowly, "Do not betray the entire dynasty. Think of your meaning as the imperial blood of the Chu. Do not think that you will kill me, because I do not surrender, even if you have set up a killing trap in the imperial palace." Li Lingjun lowered his head, not daring to look up. Zhao Mu's eyes narrowed slightly. This kind of cowardice, in his view, meant the answer. "It is not just me who wants to kill you. Zheng Xiu is also prepared." Li Lingjuan's voice sounded again. When his voice sounded again, the soft sounds of rats gnawing in the throne room became as dense as a storm. Killing intent covered Zhao Mu's body. "You will not have the chance to give the decree to surrender. If life and death are certain, then the key is your final attitude. I am willing to become starlight and lead the way for those who are lost in the night sky." Zhao Mu did not move. He only looked at Li Lingjun with a regretful and pitiful gaze as he spoke. Li Lingjun suddenly felt terror. "I am willing to become starlight and lead the way for those who are lost in the night sky." Zhao Mu had not created these words, but had been recorded in the military records of the Chu dynasty. The one who had said these words was a former famous general of the Chu army. Before he died defending a fortress, he had left behind these words. Just as the killing intent filling the hall was about to tear Zhao Mu apart, a burning presence covered the entire imperial palace. Everything seemed to burn like hundreds of suns had fallen into the palace at the same time. Li Lingjun finally understood what Zhao Mu wanted to do and screamed in shock. "If you did not want to kill me and summon me over, how could I have the chance to have my personal army follow me out of the palace?" Zhao Mu did not have a smug expression and said sorrowfully, "My Chu weapons are the best in the world, the weapons that guard the Chu capital. How can they not burn down a mere imperial palace?" He and Li Lingjuan's figures, this grand throne room, and all the halls and courtyards in the imperial palace disappeared in the golden flames. His voice was still echoing in the fire, but everything quickly turned to scorched earth and smoke. Many soldiers gave sorrowful cries outside the palace. The condensed golden flames soared into the sky as if thousands of golden phoenixes were flying out of the flames. They flew into the sky, and they were also like many proud souls that were pouncing into the distant and silent starry sky. Chu Gongjin. Chapter 678. In the Yin Mountain, the strongest emperor in the history of the Qin dynasty, Yuanwu, started to return to Chongling. His carriage was unusually simple. There was only one carriage and several horses. The rain was no longer falling. The cultivator holding the yellow paper umbrella was no longer holding it, and was sitting at the front of the carriage. The dark clouds above the Een mountain dissipated. The bright light came down and illuminated his face. This was a man in his 50s, with a thin face and an exquisite long beard. The Yuanwu Emperor's caravan returning to Chongling was simple here, but as long as he accompanied and protected, there would be no problems. Because his surname was Su, and he was one of the bureau chiefs of the Qin dynasty. In all the records and military information, he was overseas helping the Yuanwu Emperor search for spirit medicines. However, his enormous fleet, with its terrifying power, had already arrived at the Chu capital. And he was here. Even more importantly, many years ago, he had been one of the top cultivators of Chongling, and the elder of the other bureau chiefs. When Mo Shoqing passed away, and the Donghu monk who had appeared out of nowhere was seriously injured and could not recover, when Bailey Sushiwa's cultivation was almost crippled in the entire world, on the way back, no one could pose a threat to him. Not even Zhao Si. If there was a variable, then his existence was the greatest variable in this war. What a waste of resources. A young person climbed up the broken city walls of the Chu capital. Looking at the burning imperial palace and the city filled with panic and doomsday scenes, he shook his head and said disdainfully, the Chu capital had been completely breached. The sturdy city walls that had taken hundreds of years to build were shattered by the various siege seal weapons on the warships. The nether floats pressed down on this young man like a mountain. The heads of the ships crashed into the ruins of the city walls, but the heads of the ships were not damaged at all. From the rubble, a dark and cold luster was still emanating. At this time, the Chu dynasty cultivators had created many scars on the surface of these monster-like ships. Many of the scars even reached into the cabins. Yet all the closed cabin doors were open, and all kinds of enormous military equipment came out. Most of the ships were equipped differently, and these ships looked like different giant steel hedgehogs. The seal weapons crisscrossed to form a steel forest. The energies that had not completely disappeared from the battle surged inside, creating all kinds of strange howls as they collided. Mixed with the thick Een energy, it was like a ghost realm. The powerful seal weapons and sword formations in the ships, especially the overwhelming number of grandmasters that walked out, quickly destroyed the resistance along the shore. The soldiers and cultivators on the ships did not suffer many casualties. Compared to the city walls, these densely packed giant warships were even sturdier fortresses. At this time, the number of people walking out of these giant ships and disembarking was astonishing. The soldiers were as dense as clouds. Each ship had thousands of people and more than 100,000 soldiers. Among them were large numbers of cultivators and grandmasters from Qi. And compared to the doomsday scene of the Chu capital, the most striking thing was that the people on these giant ships disembarked in an orderly manner. Not only were the military carriages extremely orderly, but there was also a complete group of envoys, officials, ceremonial officials, and even maids. This scene was like a country migrating. This young person wore the official robes of the Qi dynasty. He was one of the first people to disembark in the diplomatic mission, and clearly one of the most important officials representing Qi. But one of his hands was crippled. Even if it was hidden in his sleeve, it looked strange and even disgusting. Compared to fighting to the death, the surrender of some of the nobles in the city was very efficient. Many local street battles were still continuing. Some of the commoner cultivators who usually lived in seclusion had already fought against the Qin army. Yet some of the diplomatic missions formed by the surrendered nobles had already come to the ruins of the city walls. The leaders of these surrenders were King Cheng of Chu and Zhongzheng. The former was one of Li Lingjuan's elder brothers by bloodline. However, he was born mentally retarded. Before this, he had been arranged to retire in a piece of land in the countryside of the Chu capital, and had been casually given the title of king. His use at this time was clearly just as a symbol. His fat and swollen face was filled with shock. His head was shrunk between his collar, and he didn't even dare to stick his head out. Zhongzheng was one of the ministers of the Chu dynasty, and a very powerful official in court. At the same time, he was one of Li Lingjuan's retainers and confidants. In reality, he was the mouthpiece of the surrenders. When he saw the face of the young person on the city walls, Zhong Zheng's eyes widened in disbelief. Because he recognized this young person. Not long ago in Chongling, this young person was just a target of ridicule and disdain. The young person naturally recognized him. Looking at Zhong Zheng, whose eyes were wide, this young person smiled gently and said, "Long time no see, Brother Zhong." Zhong Zheng quickly lowered his head. First, he expressed humility. Secondly, he could not let this young person see the changes on his face. Official Su Qin, he bowed deeply and said, "No need to be so polite." Su Qin looked coolly at him and put away all his emotions. He said, "In the future, I will need Brother Zhong's help in matters of Chu." Zhong Zheng did not know how to respond to the sudden change in status between the two sides. No need to think too much. We are just a wave in this river. The changes in our encounters will only depend on the strength of the master we follow. Su Qin's voice grew so low that only he and Zhong Zheng could hear. But the larger the empire is, the harder it is to control many places. Here, you represent the old Chu, I represent the Qin and Qi. You and I are the future of this place. Zhong Zheng heard some of the meaning in Su Qin's words and couldn't help but feel shocked. Everything will follow official Su's arrangements. Zhong Zheng bowed again and then asked softly, "Why is the Qi Emperor here?" This was his stance. As long as he showed that he listened to Su Qin and stood on his side, he could ask such a private and puzzling question. Everything was for profit. An existence like the Qi Emperor would not be so stupid to sacrifice an ally like the Chu. To anyone, the Chu was the Qi's shield. Even if the Chu was destroyed, there was still the Yin. By doing this, the Qi dynasty was not just betraying the Chu dynasty, but also the Yin. In this world, only true power is the most fascinating. Su Qin smiled. Of all power, what everyone desires the most is not to rely on the power of others, but to have power that they can truly control. Chapter 679. When he said this, his eyes were filled with emotion. In this capital that had lost all fighting spirit and was in chaos, more nobles and wealthy merchants came in front of the envoy group to express their surrender and loyalty. There were more cowardly and fickle people than those who dared to persist and have their own unchanging wills. Even if what he said was a truth that everyone knew, many people spoke of fate. How many people had the courage to persist and change their own fate? How many people did a dynasty have? But usually, just the battle of millions of soldiers would decide the fate of a dynasty. Just like now, these nether floats only carried 100,000 soldiers. Just defeating the defending army here was already a sign of conquest. A young wolf could scare a herd of pigs. Even more importantly, these pigs could help this wolf scare and control other pig herds. At this time, in Su Qin's eyes, these nobles who were born in peace and worried about losing their peace were no different from pigs. Many unburned embers fell into an empty courtyard and landed on the neatly piled firewood. Smoke slowly rose from the firewood. After a while, some flames started to burn. Then the entire firewood burned silently. The tongues of flame spat up the walls and slowly ignited the eaves on one side. This was a scene happening in the Chu capital, but it was like the fate of this dynasty. The Chu dynasty had large numbers of troops in the Yangshan Commandery and the Yin Mountains. They were still fighting with the armies of the Qin dynasty. In the central Chu capital and the northeast, there were large amounts of granaries and the lands of the prestigious families. There were large numbers of workshops. These could continuously send fresh blood to the border army. But when the Chu capital fell, many nobles lost their fighting spirit, and many prestigious families also fell. The entire center and northeast of the Chu dynasty would fall into a state of being leaderless. Especially after losing consort Zhao's iron rule, the choices of most of the prestigious families could not be predicted. Most thought-provoking were the actions of the Yin dynasty. Yuan Wu and Zheng Xiu had never worried about the losses of the Qin dynasty. From the start of the war, Yuan Wu and Zheng Xiu had shown that they planned to throw all of their decades of accumulation into this war. Therefore, the Qin dynasty's army, which had retreated to the border, was bound to launch a counterattack at all costs. In this war, Chu did not have much of a chance of winning. They could not care about the border with the Yin and Qi dynasties. Then next, would the Yin dynasty send troops to Qi, or would they feel that they were unstoppable and take the opportunity to send troops into the territory of the Chu dynasty, seize large amounts of resources in the rich northeast that were beneficial to them, and strengthen the strength of their dynasty? Su Qin believed that the Yin emperor would choose the latter. Firstly, there wasn't much choice. Secondly, this was the weakness of human nature. If both Yin and Qi suffered heavy losses, even if the Qin dynasty lost its national power, the final winner would still be the Qin dynasty. Therefore, part of the lamentation in his eyes and the mockery in his heart was because of this. Where did those people go? An old man walked into another part of the imperial palace. His shout was close to a roar, and the flames of the giant candles by the wall flickered. This was the imperial palace of Qi. The ground was paved with black mountain stone, and the walls were ordinary rough stone. It was not as grand as the Chu imperial palace, and appeared slightly cold. The Qi emperor wore black robes and sat on the dragon throne. Long and wide black cloth hung from his sides, embroidered with strange seal scripts. These seal scripts caused the energy in the depths of the imperial palace to become very weak. Even if a Realm 7 Grandmaster came here, they would likely only be able to use the power of a Realm 3 or 4 cultivator. What do you mean? Hearing the old man's roar, the Qi emperor said humbly and peacefully. This old man was Marquis Tianyang, and in terms of seniority, he was his uncle. At this time, in the Qi dynasty, he was likely the only existence that could threaten his throne. Han Luoli, Qi Siren, the grandmasters of the Qi dynasty, and those generals, where did they go? Marquis Tianyang's lips were purple in anger. He said, also, our Huayin sect and Tomb Seal workshop left on ships 3 months ago. What? You still want to hide it from me at this time? How long do you want to hide it from me? Uncle, so you've already investigated so thoroughly. The Qi emperor sighed softly and said, but it is still too late. There was a rare sincerity and seriousness in his words. Marquis Tianyang felt cold and said, what do you mean? They have already gone to the Chu capital. The Qi emperor looked into his eyes and said, if there are no surprises, the envoys of the Qi and Qin have already conquered the Chu capital. While he had a premonition, hearing the Qi emperor say it personally, Marquis Tianyang still felt a wave of coldness charge out of his head. Are you crazy? Have you not heard of the story of asking a tiger for its skin? Are you an idiot? His mind was blank, and he cursed in anger, completely forgetting the difference between ruler and subject. The Qi emperor did not answer. The imperial palace was silent, but the Qi emperor was not angry. He just looked calmly at him and was as humble as usual. You should not think so. When Marquis Tianyang's heavy breathing sounded in the hall, but when he finally recovered his normal breathing, the Qi emperor said, you should ask me the true reason. Also, you have forgotten one thing. Marquis Tianyang took a deep breath, his voice as loud as an old python sucking in water. His chest rose high, but he did not speak and just looked at the Qi emperor. He did not disguise his emotions and thoughts. If the Qi emperor could not give him a convincing reason, he would risk his life to have many people rebel. The Qin dynasty is very strong. After the reform, they destroyed the Han, Zhao, and Wei dynasties. Their power is terrifying. The Chu dynasty is also very strong. 20 to 30 years ago, who was a match for the Chu dynasty? The Qi emperor looked at him and said slowly, but many years ago, when the 7 dynasties were equal, many small countries called the 7 greatest dynasties the 7 heroes. Of the 7 heroes, the Qi was once the strongest. Uncle, do not forget. After the Qi is the Chu, and after the Chu is the Qin. The Chu weapons are the best in the world. But in the past, one of our officials defected to the Chu with his retainers. The Qin swordsmen are the best in the world. The Qi is only skilled in the cunning of ghosts and ghosts to compete with the heroes of the world. But 100 years ago, The Chu dynasty was the strongest in the world. The Qi has been weak for a long time. First, we experienced internal strife and lost several important commanderies. Most importantly, we lost the most important thing, the most important inheritance. I just want to take back what belongs to us. Who says I am asking a tiger for its skin? The Qi emperor looked at Marquis Tianyang, whose gaze had changed. He grimaced and said, "Who is the tiger?" Marquis Tianyang could not control his shock and said in shock, "The leader of the 12 shamans." Chapter 680. Have I really gone mad? The Emperor of Qi looked at the shocked Marquis Tianyang and sighed. If not for the heads of the 12 shamans and the Grave Seal Mountain, would I and Zheng Xiu work together to take a share from the Chu? Marquis Tianyang was still shocked, speechless. He recovered after a long time and said in a trembling voice, "Zheng Xiu is really willing to return the heads of the 12 shamans to our dynasties." The Emperor of Qi's lips curled into an indescribable smile. The heads of the 12 shamans are already in our dynasty. Marquis Tianyang's body suddenly froze. Already in our dynasty? The Grave Seal Workshop has already inspected them and sent them to the Yin Temple. Even though the Emperor of Qi was just stating, he could not help but feel excited. His voice trembled. The ceremony has been arranged. We only need to wait for the heads of the 12 shamans to return. Marquis Tianyang was silent for a long time before he finally calmed down. Will the Grave Seal Mountain be returned to our dynasty? He looked at the Emperor of Qi and asked seriously. The Emperor of Qi nodded. This is the condition that the Grave Seal Workshop is willing to do. Marquis Tianyang was silent. No one knew what he was thinking. The Emperor of Qi's gaze grew warm. He said, "Uncle, do you think it is worth it for me to do this?" Marquis Tianyang slowly nodded. Then he took a deep breath and said, "Of course it is worth it. The heads of the 12 shamans will return. The Grave Seal Mountain will return to our dynasty. Even if we have to pay with our lives, it is worth it." But the Emperor of Qi frowned slightly. He looked at Marquis Tianyang, who was hesitating, and said, "But what?" Marquis Tianyang shook his head and said, "But you have forgotten one thing. You have wronged Teacher Yin." The Emperor of Qi grew silent. If Teacher Yin was alive, he would not have the Grave Seal Workshop and Zheng Xiu work together against the Chu. So regardless of whether you did it intentionally or not at the Deer Mountain Conference, he is still dead. Only when he is dead can your plan be carried out. As Marquis Tianyang spoke, he started to feel pain. Teacher Yin is someone that many cultivators of our dynasty respect and desire to become. He also has an heir. When the news of the Chu falling spread, if I can think of this, his heir and many cultivators of our dynasty will think of this. They will not forgive you. Emperor Qi was silent for a few breaths. Then his face became firm and solemn again. Just like you said, even if these people hate, they hate me and not Qi. As long as I can make my dynasty a tiger again, even if I have to pay with my life, it will be worth it. So please support me, uncle. He stood up from the dragon throne and bowed deeply to Marquis Tianyang. Marquis Tianyang felt that this was natural. However, when he looked at the Qi emperor's bearing, other than being shocked by the news, he was not very moved. Because he thought of Teacher Yin. In the past, Emperor Qi respected and relied on Master Yin more than anyone else. The flames in the Chu capital that had not been extinguished for a long time burned half the sky red and gradually merged with the sunset. The river flowed east. After passing through Chu and Qi, they reached the easternmost part of the country. However, they made a turn and entered the Qin territory. They intersected with the great rivers from Qin and merged into the Eastern Sea. The easternmost Jiaodong commandery was like a long and narrow fong, one end piercing into the Qin and the other into the sea. Other than spirit medicines and sea beasts, precious jewels and spices, Jiaodong commandery's most important product was food. When large amounts of fish were made into dried goods, they could satisfy a third of the Qin's meat needs. In a certain fish farm, large amounts of small fish the thickness of a finger were cooked in hot water and laid on the flat stone ground. They gave off heat and a stench in the setting sun. After being exposed to the sun for a few days, these dried fish could be cooked simply and emit a fresh and delicious taste. It could make even the most simple and crude food in the army delicious. A woman in a yellow robe sat on a bamboo chair, watching the transformation process day after day. Many laborers in her sight were doing this kind of work day after day. Even when a middle-aged man walked into the fish farm under the setting sun, he did not attract the attention of those people. He still came. The woman sighed in her heart. She still sat there and looked at the man. It wasn't until this dark-skinned, short, and strong middle-aged man was not far from her that she said with some arrogance, "Zhang Shiwu?" The middle-aged man smiled and said, "Mistress Biu?" The woman smiled slightly in silent acknowledgement. Who would have thought that Zheng Xiu's foster mother would always live in a place like this? The middle-aged man sniffed and said, "This smell is not good. What you smell from a young age, you will get used to the smell. It is the same with what you eat." Wrinkles appeared at the corners of the woman's eyes. "Also, she is preventing me from being found by you Bazinkindo ground people. But I had not thought that you would be so bored as to find me here. Killing other people's relatives, or holding other Qin people hostage to threaten others. This is one of her favorite methods. But such methods are not of much use to her." The woman looked at Zhang Shiwu and said, "Even if you kill me, she will not feel much pain. I'm just a foster mother to her. You Bazinkindo ground people entered Jiaodong Commandery when you were weak. Shouldn't you be doing something more meaningful? Everyone knows that she is ruthless. You do not need to remind her." Zhang Shiwu laughed. He looked at the woman and said, "What is more useful than destroying Jiaodong Commandery is using Jiaodong Commandery. We know that Granny Huang Nunnery is not an island. Granny Huang Nunnery was not an island." The words were strange and sudden at this time. However, upon hearing these words, the calm and smiling woman's expression suddenly changed. Her ruddy face turned incomparably pale. "There is no meaning in threatening her. But what about threatening you?" Zhang Shiwu looked seriously at the woman. "She is just your foster daughter. You only raised her for a while, but is that really all? Only you know the exact location of Granny Huang Nunnery. You have the sea map of its movements. That is the true Jiaodong Commandery. The wealth of the Zheng family is there." After a pause, Zhang Shiwu looked at her and said, "You have a son and a beloved granddaughter. Now, if we use their lives to exchange for the sea map, are you willing?" The old woman's lips trembled. Her gaze landed on Zhang Shiwu's hand. There was a small piece of white jade in the shape of a fish. That was her favorite granddaughter's accessory. "You really will not kill them and will let them go?" The old woman said in a trembling voice. "We will let you go," Zhang Shiwu said with slight disdain. Coming to Jiaodong Commandery to kill some people and make her sad and angry, that is truly boring. What will make her feel pain is losing the support of all of Jiaodong Commandery. Chapter 681. Singing sounded in the night. This was the sound of home. On the battlefield, the army was not allowed to sing songs about their homeland. It would make people sad and remind them of their homeland, of their loved ones who were waiting for them in the distance. For some soldiers, it might arouse their fighting spirit, but for most soldiers, it would make them feel powerless. So this kind of singing usually came from the enemy. A deathly silence covered the Chu camp in Yangshan Commandery. Occasionally, cries would come from the civilian camps on the outskirts. It was summer. The battlefield around Yangshan Commandery started to become hot and humid. Some diseases, due to the lack of clean water, started to spread. Each day, people would die due to the lack of medicine. Yet for both the Chu and Qin armies, what they lacked the most was food. Starting half a month ago, the Chu army had lost their supplies from the rear. The news that the Chu capital had fallen, along with most of the supply routes being cut off, had reached the border army. The Chu dynasty army had not wanted to fight a long battle on the front lines, so they quickly ran out of supplies. In reality, the Qin army was also in a difficult situation. Because the Qin army had been retreating, they had lost most of their supplies. When they started their full-scale counterattack a dozen days ago, Most of the Qin army lacked weapons and supplies. Facing the seal weapons of the Chu army, they would pay a great price. In the last dozen days of fighting, the Qin army had still been unable to counterattack and had suffered many losses. The Chu army relied on the Qin supplies and war horses to barely survive. Yet the problem was that the two sides were in different states of mind. If this was in the past, no matter how poor the Chu army was, as long as the Qin army was not a match for them, they could chase into the depths of the Qin dynasty and keep fighting. But now, they were alone and without help. No matter how poor the Qin army was, they had endless reinforcements. This kind of expenditure would eventually consume all of the Chu army on the border. One side was killing the remnants of the enemy. The other side was struggling in despair. In the darkness, Consort Zhao did not sleep. She stood under a banner in front of the tent, listening to the familiar singing in the distance. She feared she would not hear this kind of sound for a long time in the future. Footsteps sounded. Xiang Yin stood not far from her and bowed to pay his respects. "Is there any news about Yin?" she asked casually. Xiang Yin was silent for a while and then nodded. The Yin emperor sent out his army and occupied the 13 cities between Heaven's Gate and the Yin territory. His excuse is to help us stop the Qin. Just as we expected, Consort Zhao didn't get angry. Instead, she smiled and said, "If it were me, I would do the same." If they did not take the opportunity to divide the spoils, could it be that they were going to attack Qin? If he was not careful, he would immediately fall into Qin Shi's pincer attack. We might as well take the opportunity to reap the benefits. Xiang Yin looked at her eyes that were still bright in the night and said, "Yin Mountain has sent news that the encirclement to kill the 9-death silkworm failed. Tang Mei has led his remaining troops to break through Yin Mountain and seek refuge with Wuji. This is the best news. Even this did not kill the 9-death silkworm. Zheng Xiao will not be able to sleep at night." Consort Zhao shook her head. She didn't seem surprised. "I just heard that many grandmasters died in that place." Xiang Yin smiled bitterly. He thought it wasn't just many. There were many unknown, well-known, and Realm 7 grandmasters who died on that battlefield. Even if it was still a distance from the Battle of Chongling back then, it likely surpassed most of the famous battles recorded in the history books. 5 out of 10 grandmasters in the world have gone. Qin Shu has gone the most. In the future, Yin and Qi will have many grandmasters. I fear that this is why Qi has accepted the alliance with Zheng Xiao, and Yin has accepted the present situation. Xiang Yin grimaced and said, "Of course Qi is willing to accept Qin's self-imposed killing trap. Whether those people on the Bazinkendo ground die or not, they are still Qin people to them. Yin and Shinran are not possible." Consort Zhao said coolly, "Qi will betray us, and naturally will betray them. With wolves and wolves nearby, who can sleep peacefully. Originally, they appear to be united but are divided at heart. In the future, they will each have their own plans, and it will be difficult for them to walk together. It is inevitable that they will fight." Xiang Yin sighed. He was a famous general of the Chu. Especially after Li Mu left, he and Tang Mei would likely be the best generals of the Chu, and naturally had good insight. While Zheng Xiao's move had wounded herself greatly, and the advantage of the cultivators of the Qin dynasty would most likely be gone forever, she had caused a conflict between Yin and Qi, and made it difficult for Yin and Qi to work together. In his view, this deal was still profitable, but that was a distant matter. What was right in front of him was where the remaining 700,000 soldiers should go. These good men who had lost their homeland and loved ones. Other than dying here, what other choice did they have? What were the people of the Bazinkendo ground doing? It was as if the heavens had heard his inner resentment and cries. At this moment, a general hurriedly arrived in front of him and handed him a secret letter. Xiang Yin quickly tore it open. Just one look, and he was a little surprised. "Lin Zhujiao wants us to go east to Jiaodong Commandery." He took a deep breath and tried to calm himself down. He looked at Consort Zhao and said, "He says they will try to control Jiaodong Commandery." Consort Zhao smiled slightly and seemed to relax. She said, "Then we will go." Xiang Yin was slightly hesitant. because he knew the difference in the words. Trying to control and being able to control were very different. Also, from Yangshan Commandery to Jiaodong Commandery, they would pass through the Nanquan Commanderies. Seeing the hesitation in his eyes, Consort Zhao's smile grew brighter. She knew where his hesitation came from. The Nanquan Commanderies were the gathering place of the eastern families of the Chu dynasty. Those gentry had once been the ones who opposed her rule the most. Even more importantly, they had many powerful cultivators, retainers, and private armies. After Li Lingjun sat on the throne, they had tried to assassinate Li Lingjun and her several times. It was not realistic in the eyes of any general to pass through there to Jiaodong Commandery. It was easy to be chased by the Qin army when the front was blocked and attacked from both front and back. In the past, they felt that I was a woman and not useful, and that I stole the country. Now, I am taking the Chu people to flee. Let's see what attitude they have now. Consort Zhao took a deep breath and let the feeling of strength fill her tired body again. Then she said, also, other than the Bazin Kindo ground, what other allies are worthy of our trust? Never underestimate the power of the Bazin Kindo ground. Since Lin Zhuzhou said he will try to control Jiaodong Commandery, then it is a good choice for us. Chapter 682. On the ground, spring and summer passed. Even the powerful Chu dynasty was collapsing. But in the underground cellar of Chongling, the temperature did not change much. Hu Hai had lost a lot of weight, and his skin was unusually pale. Like many animals that lived underground for a long time, his body even gave off a faint glow. But he did not have many wounds on his body right now. He did not even have chains or other restrictions. He appeared to be able to move freely. There were many thin and bloody pieces of meat on the stone plate in front of him. These pieces of meat were raw rat meat. Because Shun Xian had stored large amounts of food in this cellar, rats would often come smelling the scent of food. These rats naturally could not escape Shun Xian's perception. On the battlefield where Qin and Chu were fighting, rat meat was sometimes used as emergency food. Many soldiers would dig 3 feet into the ground to dig up plant tubers and rats to satisfy their hunger. However, the rat meat in front of Hu Hai had not been carefully cleaned. It was mixed with a lot of rat hair and dirt and looked extremely disgusting. Every time his gaze landed on the smelly rat meat, Hu Hai would retch, but he did not dare to make a sound. Shun Xian was standing not far in front of him. He was using a rag of unknown color to clean a blade that was fixed to the wall. The time in the cellar was unusually long, so his movements were slow and meticulous. He seemed to be polishing some jade artifact to pass the time. Hu Hai! After a long time, he put down the cloth in his hand and said the word. Then he looked expressionlessly at Hu Hai and said, "Eat it. The taste is actually very good, comparable to the most delicious food in the world." Hu Hai was a legendary beast that had gone extinct long ago. This kind of beast was only recorded in the records of the cultivation world, and there were no authoritative records of what it looked like. Even the vast majority of cultivators did not know the name of this ferocious beast, much less mention such a rare name. However, these 2 words seemed to carry some kind of strange magic power. Hu Hai, who had been retching all this time, blushed when he heard those 2 words. Even his eyes were filled with greed. It was as if he had seen the most delicious food in the world, and he almost threw himself onto the stone plate. He chewed with big mouthfuls. Not only did he finish all the bloody pieces of raw meat, he didn't even miss a single drop of blood on the stone plate. Shun Xian looked at him silently and expressionlessly. In the next few breaths, he bowed his head, thinking that he would soon be able to go out and see Chongling. Chongling above was very cold and cheerless. The desolation came from the Great Purge after Yi Sealing's defection and Min Mountain Sword Sect's Bailey Sushiwe's invasion of the Imperial Palace. Many officials were involved, and many people died in the battle. There were also many people who were afraid of being implicated and quickly left. Crucially, many sword schools and cultivation grounds disappeared overnight, not because of the encirclement of the army, but because they could no longer endure the control of the Imperial Palace. One of the more lively places today was Red River Town, a small town on the shore of the Wei River outside Chongling. This was a port where many merchant ships were docked. It was rich in clay that could be used to make pottery. There were many merchant ships that came and went. The mud at the bottom of the river was red and caused the water of the river to turn red. The war at the border was serious, and what was lacking the most was food. Next was carriages and horses. Of course, there was also a shortage of medicine. Among them, the most important was hemostatic medicine. Yet as the weather grew hot and humid, medicine to stop diarrhea and wounds from festering suddenly became important. Today, most of the ships docked on the shore of this small town came from important businesses in Guangzhou. The people who came ashore were people who were rarely seen, and some of the legendary wealthy. But these Guangzhou wealthy had ugly expressions. Before everyone detected that all the medicines were in short supply, these Guangzhou tycoons suddenly found that most of the medicine to stop bleeding and most of the medicinal materials to make medicine to cure diarrhea and festering had been taken by a mysterious rich merchant. Having a sense of smell ahead of everyone and hoarding scarce resources, this was understandable in the business world. However, many of the finished medicinal ingredients were controlled by the imperial court, and some businesses had to complete a certain amount within a limited time. When these ingredients were monopolized by others, and the price was raised several times for no reason, the price of the finished medicinal ingredients sold by these businesses could not be increased. This was not just a matter of taking the opportunity to make money from the war. This was stepping on the faces of all the Guangzhou wealthy and taking money from their pockets. Who dared to do this? It wasn't just the officials of the bureaus who were connected to these Guangzhou wealthy. It wasn't just that many cultivators had left Guangzhou to become generals in the army. Even most of the cultivation places in Chongling received funding from these Guangzhou wealthy each year. The only thing that prevented these tycoons from completely flaring up was that this mysterious person possessed a terrifying amount of wealth. Otherwise, he would not have been able to use such a thunderous method to quietly buy out so many medicinal herbs. Moreover, this mysterious person had given them a chance to talk. Xie Lianing came ashore, surrounded by multiple important people of Guangzhou, and walked towards the quietest inn in this small town. As the head of the Guangzhou wealthy, he naturally had to be the leader to discuss such a challenge. But he was worried, and his mind was not on this. After Min Mountain Sword Sect was destroyed, his daughter Xie, who had studied the sword in Min Mountain Sword Sect, had disappeared. Before that, Xie Changxing had also disappeared. Compared to the news of his son and daughter, this matter was not the most important thing to him. However, when he followed the other party's request and walked alone into the quiet room in the deepest part of the inn, the first thing that entered his ears was a voice that stunned him. Father. The voice of these two words was incomparably familiar, yet also strange. Changxing. Xie Lianing's eyes widened as he looked in disbelief at the young person shrouded in the dim light. For some reason, he felt a lump in his throat. That was not the son he dreamed of and worried about all day. In the dim light, the son who had been idle in the past seemed to have matured greatly. Xie Changxing bowed deeply to his father, whom he had been thinking about day and night, and then said softly, "Using this method to get you here and obtain a chance to meet you, it's actually not a matter of business or this medicinal herb." "What do you mean?" Xie Lianing was stunned for a long time before he recovered. "What are you doing? How can you do such a thing?" Xie Changxing was very excited to meet father and son in such a situation. His hands trembled in his sleeves, but his expression was solemn. He did not answer his father's question and quickly said softly, "Zheng Xiu is about to act against Guangzhou." Chapter 683. What do you mean? Xie Lianing was not a powerful cultivator, but to be able to become a wealthy person in Guangzhou, he was used to seeing storms. He quickly calmed his excitement, looked deeply at his unfamiliar son, and asked again. "She wants to build 3 workshops, borrow the craftsmen of each family, and borrow money from each family." Xie Changxing's answer was unusually simple, and could even be said to be crude. "But both the people and the money borrowed will not be returned for the time being. In less than a year, the families in Guangzhou will only have the carriage business, linen clothing, rice, and some metal businesses. Most of them will not be in the hands of the families. Xie Lianning's expression changed several times. The greatest source of profit for the wealthy in Guangzhou was not the flow of money, but daily necessities. Clothing and food were naturally the most important. Even if it is for wartime, each family has their own considerations. She cannot just say whatever she wants. She does not dare to anger the public. It will not be public anger. Hearing his father's words, Xie Chongqing shook his head and said, "The Qi family will be the first to agree, and so will the Tong family. At that time, she will only have to face the Xie family and the Xin family." The Qi family and the Tong family will agree? Xie Lianning's expression changed completely. If half of the most important families in Guangzhou suddenly changed sides, the remaining could not withstand the pressure from Chongling. "Father, there are some things you may not know." Xie Chongqing looked at his father, who had an ugly expression, and said softly and slowly, "Ding Ning is not dead, and he is the heir to the 9-death silkworm." Xie Lianning's eyebrows jumped, and he could not speak. "I'm missing now. Father, you can treat me as dead, but there is still my sister. My sister received the inheritance of Min Mountain Sword Sect. Just like Jing Lioli, she is a true disciple of Sect Master Bailey. Just based on this, Zheng Xiu will not treat the Xie family like the other families. The Xin family is the same." Xie Chongqing looked at him and said, "This is the true reason I risked coming to see you." Xie Lianning was silent for a long time. He had to recover from this frightening news and regain his clarity of mind. "So you're now working together with the people of the Bazinkendo ground?" he asked, "helping those who are close to us rather than reason." Xie Chongqing nodded and said, "This is the choice of us young people. You don't have to agree, but I hope you and Mother are okay. You were all raised by me, and I was the one who taught you." "What do you mean by you don't have to agree?" Xie Lianning snorted heavily. "If you think I will cut ties with you and stand on Zheng Xiu's side, then you look down on me too much." Xie Chongqing smiled and didn't argue with his father. However, he immediately became serious and said, "The Xin family is reasonable. Father, if you personally come forward, it should be easy to convince them. I won't lower the price of the medicinal materials in my hands. You and the Xin family can force the other families to accept this price. Before Zheng Xiu makes her move, a portion of the Xie and Xin family's wealth must be transferred to me. If you succeed as you say, then not just us and the Xin family, but the other families in Guangzhou will also have a large amount of wealth in your pocket." Xie Lianning looked emotionally at Xie Chongqing and said, "You are playing with too much capital, and you have snowballed a few % of Guangzhou's profits. What do you plan to do next? I once taught you that you cannot put all your eggs in one basket. Do you not feel it is dangerous to have such wealth on you alone? I know Father is worried about how I will protect such wealth, but this is not a problem for me." Xie Chongqing smiled and said, "Father, you have forgotten my nickname in Guangzhou. What I am best at is spending all this wealth quickly." Xie Lianning nodded, but he didn't smile. He asked seriously, "How do I spend it?" "The Chu is in chaos. The Chu armies will be entangled in the south and north for a long time. Not just the Qin dynasty's armies in the Chu, the Yin and Qi armies are also dividing the Chu lands. As long as the Yin and Qi are not destroyed by the Qin dynasty, I do not know how long this chaos will last. Also, the Qin dynasty does not appear to have the ability to quickly destroy the Yin and Qi. At this time, as long as one is rich and willing to spend money, it is not a problem to recruit soldiers in the Chu." Xie Chongqing said calmly, "Also, I will have the support of Consort Zhao and the others." Xie Lianning's eyes narrowed slightly. In troubled times, heroes rose together. This was not something a businessman should do. It was too dangerous. But compared to what Xie Chongqing was doing now, there was not much difference. "The Xin family will agree." Xie Lianning nodded slowly. He looked at Xie Chongqing and said, "I do not need to persuade them. They came to me before to talk about Shenyi. For them, Shenyi is more important than some property. Even more importantly, it is a good deal to invest in the Bazinkendo ground. Also, I have put in my son and daughter. Then I will trouble Father." Xie Changxing took a deep look at Xie Lianying. Suddenly, he couldn't help but take a step forward and hug his father. Then he said, I can't stay here for too long. After this is over, I hope father can retire as soon as possible. Then it will depend on your arrangements. Xie Lianying felt his nose sting. Looking at his son, who had retreated into the darkness ahead, he said, Your mother misses you. Xie Changxing nodded and didn't say anything else. He left through a secret door at the back. We cannot negotiate. Xie Lianying said to some of the Guangzhong managers as he walked out of the door. Before these Guangzhong elites could get angry, he said, No matter what, we must first deal with the present situation. The Xie family will take the lead. Demon consort Zhao wants to pass through me. What right does she have? Does she count as a Chu person? Right now, in the capital, most of those who side with the Qin and Qi are favorite officials that Li Lingjun brought back from Chongling. Just thinking about these people makes me feel disgusted. Far from Xie Changxing and Xie Lianying, in a meeting hall in the interior of the Chu territory, there were more than a dozen people sitting. These people's faces were all hidden in the darkness, but they were all cold and gave off a dark and dangerous presence that only those with great power would have. These were the Nanquan commandery families of the eastern Chu territory. The Chu dynasty was used to calling Nanquan, Qingshan, Helei, Duli, and Junshan commanderies the Nanquan commanderies because 3 of the families that ruled these 5 commanderies were in Nanquan commandery. In the mouths of former Chu officials, these families were often connected with words like barbarians, wolves, and bandits. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.